Chapter 1. Gail Brown entered the small country church alongside 8 of her sisters. The room was filled with chatter from well-dressed guests. She had finally arrived at the matchmaking dance, and she was excited to find a potential suitor. "Miss Brown, you seem to know exactly what you're looking for," a voice chimed from behind. Elizabeth Tandy, the matchmaker herself, approached with an amicable smile, her blonde hair catching the light in a halo around her caring face. "Mrs. Tandy," Gail greeted, her tone respectful, but tinged with her usual candor. "I'm just taking the measure of the room." "Ah, and what sort of measure are you hoping to find?" Elizabeth inquired, green eyes twinkling with a knowing look as she sidled up beside Gail. "Someone who won't be flustered by a woman who knows her way around a toolshed more than a kitchen," Gail replied, her directness unmarred by the festive atmosphere. She looked askance at Elizabeth. "And perhaps someone who wouldn't mind a bit of defiance against societal norms, if it comes to that." "Defiance, you say?" Elizabeth's laugh was light, yet there was a glint of approval in her gaze. "You're certainly not one to wilt like a wallflower. I do believe we have a few gentlemen here who aren't seeking the usual demure company." "Good," Gail said, her lips quirking up ever so slightly. "Because I don't intend to change my ways for a husband or anyone else." "Nor should you, my dear," Elizabeth agreed, her hand lightly touching Gail's arm in encouragement. "Let's see if we can't find you a match who appreciates a strong will." "Lead on, Mrs. Tandy," Gail said with a nod, her spirits lifted by the prospect of finding someone who could keep stride with her adventurous heart. Elizabeth navigated the sea of eager bachelors and bashful maidens with practiced ease, her eyes intent on a particular figure near the fringe of the lively dance floor. The heat of the Texas summer was no match for the warmth generated by the crowded room, but Gail's anticipation seemed to cool any discomfort. "Ah, there he is," Elizabeth declared, her voice tinged with satisfaction as they approached their destination. "Max Carlson, meet Gail Brown." The gentleman in question turned toward them, and Gail studied his face for a moment. Max stood with a relaxed stance, yet there was an unmistakable command in his posture that drew the eye. A wry smile played upon his lips as he offered a nod of acknowledgement, his warm eyes meeting Gail's with intrigue. "It's good to meet you, Miss Brown," Max said, extending a hand with a congenial tilt of his head. "Tell me a little about yourself." "Well, to start with, I prefer being outside to being indoors." "I'm adept at building most anything," Gail said, accepting his handshake with a firm grip that seemed to amuse him. She studied him quickly, the practical attire, the hands roughened by honest work. Here was a man who didn't shy away from labor, much like herself. "And I am abysmal in the kitchen. I can cook a few basic meals, but nothing more." "Then we have something in common already," Max replied with a chuckle. "I can manage a business, but ask me to bake bread and you'll have a loaf fit only as a doorstop." "Perhaps together we could make something half-edible then," Gail retorted, a spark of mirth lighting up her eyes. "Or at the very least, have a grand time trying," he countered, his laughter mingling easily with hers. Their banter had the ease of two old friends, yet beneath the surface lay a current of curiosity. "Adventure, then? Is that what you seek in a partner?" Max inquired, leaning ever so slightly closer, as if sharing a secret. "Adventure is one word for it," Gail responded. "I suppose I'm looking for someone who sees the horizon and wonders what's beyond it, rather than fearing what might lurk there." "Ah, a kindred spirit," Max said, raising an eyebrow playfully. "I must confess, the idea of a life unbound by the usual constraints does hold a certain appeal." "Constraints like a ball and chain?" Gail teased, her voice light but her eyes searching. "More like traditions that no longer serve a purpose," Max clarified, his tone earnest now. "We craft our own destiny, do we not?" "Yes, I believe we do," Gail agreed, her heart fluttering at the resonance between them. "Mrs. Tandy," Max addressed Elizabeth with a respectful nod, "I believe you may have outdone yourself this evening." "Nothing brings me greater joy than matching two like-minded people," Elizabeth replied, her knowing eyes reflecting the flicker of potential between Gail and Max. With a graceful bow of her head, she excused herself, leaving the pair to continue their exploratory repartee. "Tell me, Mr. Carlson," Gail ventured, her voice steady despite the quickening of her heartbeat, "what sort of adventures have you envisioned for yourself?" With an elegant tilt of his head, Max extended a hand toward Gail. "Miss Brown," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting in a half-smile that promised shared secrets and laughter, "may I have the pleasure of this dance? We can talk more on the dance floor." Gail placed her hand in his. Together they stepped onto the dance floor, the lively strains of a fiddle igniting the air around them. They moved with a natural ease. As they glided across the polished wood, Gail's gaze met Max's, and she found herself drawn into the depth of his warm eyes. It was as if each step allowed them to traverse not just the space on the dance floor, but the very boundaries of their worlds. "Tell me, Mr. Carlson," Gail ventured, "have you ever felt the call of the wild frontier beyond the borders of Fort Worth?" "Every day," Max confessed, twirling her under his arm, before bringing her back into step with him. "There's a whole world out there, Miss Brown. Mountains that cut the sky and rivers that carve the earth. I yearn to conquer them, to make my mark. Ah, to stand atop a mountain peak and shout your defiance against the wind," Gail mused aloud, her laughter mingling with the melody. "I too crave such adventures. The orphanage was my mountain once, full of challenges to overcome." "Then it seems we are kindred spirits in our ambitions," Max replied, admiration lacing his tone. "To build something lasting, to venture where few dare to tread, that is the essence of a life well lived, don't you think?" "It is," Gail agreed, her spirit soaring with the recognition of a like-minded soul. As they danced, the rest of the room faded into a blur, leaving only the clarity of shared dreams and the pulse of possibility. "Miss Brown, Gail," Max corrected himself, the formality giving way to familiarity, "I've always believed that the best ventures are those taken together. Would you?" But the question would remain unasked, for at that moment, their dance came to an end, and the crowd erupted in applause. They parted, breathless and flushed with more than just exertion. As the applause settled, a new tune beckoned dancers to the floor, but Max and Gail lingered at its edge, their connection rendering them oblivious to the others. The heat of the Fort Worth summer night did little to cool the warmth that had sparked between them, a flame fanned by their mutual yearning for life's summits. "Max, I never thought these gatherings were places where dreams could come true," Gail confessed, her heart pounding a staccato rhythm against her ribs. "But tonight, it seems the stars have conspired to prove me wrong." "Perhaps it is not the stars, but our own spirits recognizing their counterparts," Max suggested, his gaze locked with hers, intense yet tender. "Perhaps you're right," Gail replied, her voice a whisper revealing anticipation. She felt drawn to him, as natural as a river flowing into the ocean. Max stepped closer, his presence both commanding and comforting. His hand found hers with a touch both bold and gentle. "Gail, some risks are worth taking when the heart stands to gain everything." Her breath caught in her throat at his words. "Max, what are you saying?" He took a deep breath, the air hot and still around them. "I'm saying that life is an uncharted map, and I can think of no one better to explore it with than you." His voice was steady, each word weighted with conviction. "Gail Brown, will you marry me?" The question hung between them like a sudden thunderclap. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of emotion colliding with the calm she'd found in his company. As she gazed into Max's eyes, Gail felt hope reaching toward the future, a future intertwined with his. Gail's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a measured breath, her gaze never wavering from Max's expectant eyes. Here stood a man bold enough to propose in the middle of a dance. "Max," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her, "I wasn't expecting you to ask that." "Not yet anyway." A glint of mischief danced in Max's eyes. "Well, Gail, I think sometimes life's best moments come unannounced." A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It was true. The untamed land she loved didn't plan or wait, they simply were. And wasn't that the adventure she craved? She extended her calloused hand and placed it firmly in his. "All right, Max Carlson. Yes, I will marry you." At that moment Amos Kaufman, the local minister whose gentle eyes had seen many a couple through to matrimony, approached with a stride that respected the gravity of the occasion. His modest attire bore witness to countless services rendered under the steeple and out in the fields among God's creation. "May I have the honor?" Amos asked, his voice carrying the calm assurance of a shepherd guiding his flock. Pastor Kaufman, Max replied, his tone infused with respect for the man before them. We would be thrilled to be married by you. Very well. Amos clasped his hands together, casting a serene look upon the couple. We are gathered here, under the watchful eye of our Heavenly Father and the boundless heavens, to join these two souls in the sacred covenant of marriage. The ceremony unfolded with a simplicity that seemed fitting for the occasion. Words of commitment and love were exchanged. Gail's forthright acceptance met Max's earnest pledge, and in that exchange, a bond was forged as strong as the steel rails that crossed the plains. By the power vested in me, Amos concluded, his voice rising above the soft murmur of the onlookers, I now pronounce you husband and wife. As the brief rite came to an end, the heat of the summer evening seemed to embrace the newlyweds, wrapping them in the warmth of a future filled with limitless horizons. Their hands intertwined, Gail and Max walked away from the dance floor. The echo of fiddles and laughter faded behind them, replaced by the promise of tomorrow. They moved with a sense of purpose, their steps harmonizing with the pulse of the earth beneath their feet, ready to embark on the grand adventure that lay ahead, two hearts united against the unknown. Chapter 2. Max drove Gail toward Fort Worth. The Texas heat clung to their skin like a second garment, making even the lightest fabric feel oppressive. Gail could see a group of lights up ahead, and she knew it must be Fort Worth. See there, Max said, pointing towards a dignified building that rose above its neighbors. That's where I spend most of my days. Gail followed his gaze. The structure was imposing yet elegant. She had anticipated a life framed by endless skies and the lowing of cattle, not the thrumming activity of city life. Wasn't he a rancher? The Carlson Hotel and Restaurant, he continued, a hint of pride lacing his voice. My folks just hung up their aprons for good, leaving me the keys to the kingdom. Got a cook who can make a steak sizzle just by looking at it, but could use an extra pair of hands out front. Wait tables? Gail mumbled more to herself than to him, her dreams of wide-open spaces momentarily corralled. But the disappointment that flickered across her face gave way to determination. Well, I think I can manage that. Whatever's needed. The wagon came to a stop before the hotel, and he helped her down. Gail stood, taking in the full 5 stories of the establishment. She couldn't help but marvel at the grandeur of it all, the lobby brimming with travelers, the restaurant buzzing with conversation, and the floors upon floors of rooms. Come on now, let's show you our quarters, Max said, leading her inside. They passed through the lobby, where the scent of savory dishes wafted from the adjoining restaurant, and approached an apparatus that looked quite out of place in the Old West, an elevator. Gail eyed it with curiosity. Running water in every room, and this here contraption takes us straight to the top floor. No need for stair climbing unless you fancy it, Max explained, a touch of amusement in his tone. The elevator operator nodded to Max. Mr. Carlson. 5th floor? And at Max's nod, he worked the pulleys to move the elevator up. Running water? Gail repeated, her spirits lifting. That alone felt like a luxury compared to the pump well she was accustomed to. Yes, Max confirmed with a nod as they stepped into the elevator. And wait till you see the view from our windows. As the elevator ascended, Gail's heart did likewise. Perhaps this unexpected turn wasn't such a misfortune after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was adventure to be found within these walls, too. As the elevator doors opened to the top floor, Gail stepped into what would be her new abode. The space was generous, flooded with natural light that spilled through large windows. She set down her modest suitcase, its leather worn from a life of use, and glanced around. The room seemed to invite her in, whispering promises of comfort. Here we are, Max said, gesturing grandly. What do you think? It's more than I imagined, Gail admitted, her eyes tracing the high ceilings adorned with crown molding. Makes me feel like a lady of high society. Max chuckled. Well, Mrs. Carlson, you are the lady of this establishment now. She smiled at that, the title still feeling foreign to her. But there was no time for idle thoughts when there was unpacking to do. She bent to unclasp her suitcase, laying out her limited possessions with efficient care. Clothing was folded neatly and placed into drawers that smelled faintly of cedar. Her few treasured books found their place on a small shelf beside the bed. Need any help? Max offered, leaning against the doorway with arms crossed. Thank you, but I've got it, Gail replied, her tone light-hearted yet determined. Max watched in admiration as she moved about the room, orchestrating the placement of each item like a conductor before his orchestra. Everything had its place, and Gail seemed to have a knack for creating order from chaos. Your practical skills are quite something to behold, Max commented. Thank you, Gail said, pausing to wipe her brow with the back of her hand. Had to learn quickly how to make do with what I had. Max approached Gail, his steps deliberate, his eyes lit with a tender fire. Come here, he murmured, his voice low and inviting. Gail turned toward him, her heart thrumming against her ribs. She let herself be drawn into his embrace, her body molding to his as if they were two parts of the same whole. Their kiss was gentle, a cautious exploration that deepened with each passing moment. Max was patient, giving her the space to acclimate to this new intimacy between them. Gail, for her part, welcomed the affection, her initial reservations melting away under the warmth of his touch. In the privacy of their quarters, laughter mingled with soft sighs as they discovered one another. Clothes were shed not with haste, but with an eagerness that spoke volumes of their mutual desire. When they finally came together, it was with a shared sense of wonder and joy. Max was tender, attentive to every response, every shiver that passed through Gail's frame. And Gail, she was willing, more than willing, to lose herself in the sensation, to savor the delightful playfulness of their union. As night enveloped the world outside, inside, the air was alive with whispers and giggles, the creak of bedsprings, and two people enjoying one another. They explored and reveled in the newfound pleasure, finding solace in each other's arms. Gail swept through the bustling hotel lobby. With Max in his office, it fell upon her shoulders to ensure the restaurant's patrons received service befitting the Carlson name. She glided from table to table, her smile never wavering as she jotted down orders and refilled coffee cups with a practiced hand. More pie, Mr. Henderson, she asked with a twinkle in her eye, knowing full well the answer before the portly regular could nod his enthusiastic assent. Wouldn't miss it for the world, he declared, patting his ample stomach. Her laughter rang clear, genuine, despite the repetition of their daily exchange. She whisked away, her steps brisk and purposeful as she adapted to this indoor life. Yet, as she passed by the grand windows that framed the street beyond, her gaze lingered on the horizon where the city's bustle gave way to open skies. For a brief moment, Gail imagined the feel of wind tangling through her hair, the sun casting its golden warmth on her face. Her fingers twitched at her sides, yearning for the touch of rich soil, the grip of a spade, anything that would reconnect her with the earth she so dearly missed. Mrs. Carlson, another round if you please, called out a boisterous voice from across the room, jarring her. Of course, right away. Gail replied, her voice bright, even as a wistful sigh escaped her lips, unheard amidst the clatter of plates and chatter of guests. As she moved through her tasks, every pause near the window became a stolen treasure, each glance outside a silent promise to herself. Though the walls of the Carlson Hotel were grand, they could not encapsulate the wildness within her heart. Gail stood by the bedroom window, gazing out at the expanse of Fort Worth as twilight painted the sky in strokes of tangerine and lavender. She leaned against the wood-paneled frame, her fingers tracing the contours of the glass that separated her from the natural world she craved. Something on your mind? Max's voice broke through her thoughts. Turning to face him, Gail's expression held both determination and vulnerability. Max, I've been thinking. I love what we're building here, she gestured broadly to include the bustling hotel beneath them, but there's a part of me that feels caged without the open skies and earth under my feet. Max approached her, his eyes reflecting the fading light and the sincerity within. Tell me more, Gail. Your happiness is important to me, you know that. She took a deep breath, steadying herself with the comfort found in his gaze. Back at the orphanage, I'd escape to the fields, whenever life got too confining. It was where I could breathe, think, and just be. Gail's hands, roughened from work both indoors and out, clasped together, tightly. I need that here, too. In some way or another. Max reached out, his hands enveloping hers. We'll find a way, Gail. We'll carve out a piece of the outdoors for you here. Maybe not vast prairies, but something genuine and green. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a silent vow in each motion. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, her heart swelling with affection and newfound hope. Thank you, Max. I think we can work through anything if we do it together. That's the spirit, he said, the corners of his eyes crinkling with a smile that matched her own. Now, let's figure this out. One step at a time. Max paced across the worn carpet of their top-floor living quarters, his brow furrowed in thought. What about a rooftop garden, he suggested, pausing to look at Gail. Her face brightened at the idea, a flash of the wild plains reflecting in her eyes. Could we really do that here? She asked, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. Of course, Max replied with a confident nod. We have all that space going unused under the sun. It could be your canvas, a place to grow whatever you please. Gail's lips curved into a smile, and the room seemed to grow lighter with her enthusiasm. Tomatoes, beans, maybe even some wildflowers, she mused, already envisioning rows of greenery swaying high above the city streets. Exactly, Max agreed, pleased with the direction of their brainstorming. And there are parks nearby, trails that wind through pockets of untouched nature. We could take walks, have picnics, breathe in some fresh air whenever the hotel doesn't demand our attention. Picnics, Gail repeated. I haven't been on a real picnic since forever, I wager, Max interjected gently, knowing full well the limitations of her orphanage upbringing. Then it's settled, she declared, standing up with newfound resolve. We'll start small, but we'll make it ours. A piece of the prairie right here in the city. Tomorrow, Max said, extending his hand, we venture into the great outdoors. And so, with their course charted, they retired for the evening, minds filled with expectations for tomorrow. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Max and Gail ventured out of the cool refuge of the Carlton Hotel. Gail shielded her eyes from the glare, but her step was light, almost buoyant. Around them, Fort Worth thrummed with life, yet they made their way to a quiet respite hidden within its vibrancy. Here we are, Max announced as they entered the park. Towering trees provided a canopy of shade, and the sound of a creek burbling nearby made it all so much more peaceful. Would you listen to that? She exclaimed, her gaze sweeping over the landscape. It's like music. Nature's own symphony, Max said, offering her a wicker basket filled with sandwiches and a tartan blanket. Together, they found a spot by the creek bank, where the grass was lush and inviting. Spreading out the blanket with practiced ease, they settled down, and the world beyond the park's embrace melted away. Cheers, Max said, raising his sandwich in a mock salute. Cheers, Gail responded. They ate in companionable silence, punctuated by contented sighs and the occasional comment about the beauty surrounding them. Look there, Gail pointed out, gesturing toward a rabbit nibbling on clover. Even he approves of our choice of lunch spot. Seems we've got the local seal of approval, Max responded, chuckling. As the afternoon wore on, they strolled along the creek, shoes in hand, cool water lapping at their ankles. Birds chirped overhead, and dragonflies danced in the dappled light. Thank you, Max, Gail said, squeezing his hand. For understanding, for this. Thank you, Gail, he replied, looking into her eyes, for bringing the freshness of the outdoors into my life. Gail knelt by the cluster of stones she had arranged in a neat circle, her hands deftly working to create a makeshift fire pit. The stones were warm from the day's sun, and the scent of dry grass perfumed the air as she brushed it aside. Max watched her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, his eyebrows arching slightly at the ease with which she seemed to transform the natural environment into a cozy campsite. Where did you learn to do that? He asked, squatting beside her, trying to mimic her method. Mrs. Jackson believed in practical skills for all her charges, Gail said without looking up. You never knew when you'd need to fend for yourself. She struck a match against a rock, and the kindling caught fire, crackling cheerily. Besides, I always found comfort in the rhythm of the outdoors, the way it demands your respect and rewards your efforts. Max nodded, impressed. Well, I must say, your resourcefulness is amazing. Wait until you taste my campfire stew, Gail replied with a wink, brushing her hands on her skirt before retrieving a pot and ingredients from their basket. As twilight descended upon them, Gail tended to the flames, adjusting the pot just so, allowing the stew to simmer. "Tell me a story," Max said, his voice hushed in reverence to the encroaching night. "Stories?" Gail chuckled. "Well, there was once a young girl who dreamed of touching every star in the sky. She spent nights atop the orphanage roof, reaching out as if she could pluck them right from their celestial perches." "Did she ever catch one?" Max asked, leaning closer. "In a manner of speaking," Gail mused. "She caught the feeling of freedom, of boundless possibility. That's a star in itself, isn't it?" "It is," Max agreed, his gaze fixed on her animated face, illuminated by the dance of the flames. Their meal finished, they sat side by side, shoulders touching, sharing a quietness that felt as intimate as any conversation. Eventually, Max broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. "Gail, what dreams do you harbor now? Besides star-catching, I mean." "Here, with you, they've shifted somewhat," she confessed. "I dream of creating a sanctuary, somewhere between the wilds of nature and the warmth of home, where children like I was can find a place to belong." Max nodded, his own aspirations surfacing. "I want to grow the business, but not at the expense of losing touch with this." He gestured to the open sky. "I want to build something lasting, something that has our fingerprints all over it." "Then we shall," Gail said firmly, squeezing his hand. "We'll forge our path, one that mixes your heritage with my wild spirit." "Speaking of wild spirits," Max began, a twinkle in his eye, "you brought such vibrant life to my world. You defy the norm, challenge me in the best ways." "Max Carlson, are you saying I've upset your orderly existence?" Gail teased, her laughter ringing out into the night. "Upset, enriched, words that mean the same, wouldn't you agree?" Max retorted playfully. "Perhaps," Gail conceded, resting her head against his shoulder. Underneath the vast Texas sky, their shared laughter and whispers of dreams wove together. Gail and Max strolled hand in hand through the field adjacent to their new home. Their steps were deliberate, pressing lightly against the earth, leaving a trail of unity in their wake. Despite the encroachment of evening's chill, the air between them was warm with promises. "Max," she said, her voice steady with resolve, "I think we've got ourselves a fair bit of work ahead, but I'm certain we can carve out our little piece of paradise here." "I agree, Gail," he replied, his grip on her hand tightening affectionately. "This is our property. Perhaps this could become the garden you're imagining?" Her eyes sparkled at the notion, reflecting the first stars that dared to emerge. "Oh, I do like the sound of that, and I'm sure many of our guests would like to relax in a space like this as well." They halted at the edge of the property, gazing out toward the vast expanse of Texas landscape that stretched before them. It was then that they pledged, a pact forged not just in word, but in the earnest clasp of their intertwined fingers, to honor both their needs. "Let's make it so that every child who steps into our hotel feels the adventure awaiting them just beyond the door," Max suggested. "And let's ensure they know it's perfectly fine to defy what's expected of them," Gail said, her voice tinged with the wisdom of someone who had lived that very defiance. They turned back toward the hotel, its silhouette standing proud against the twilight. The lights from within cast a welcoming glow, beckoning them to the life they were building together, a life of balance, love, and unexpected adventures. As they ascended the path leading up to the entrance, Gail allowed herself a moment of reflection. She marveled at how swiftly her life had transformed since arriving in Fort Worth, from a spirit yearning for open skies to a woman standing firm beside the man she loved, ready to face whatever the future held. "Fort Worth may not have been my planned destination," she whispered, "but I think it's exactly where I'm meant to be." Max glanced down at her, a knowing smile gracing his lips. "And I, for one, am mighty grateful for the winds that blew you my way." "Mr. Carlson," she returned with mock severity, "there's too much work to be done to talk about how thankful we are. Tomorrow, we start something new, gardening gloves and all." "I can't wait," he chuckled, opening the door for her. "Tomorrow, we plant the seeds of our future." Chapter 3. Max drove Gail to his parents' house, a large house on the outskirts of Fort Worth. Gail peered up at the home that seemed to have sprung from a page of history, its gingerbread trim casting delicate shadows across the sun-bleached porch. "Here we are," Max announced, his voice a mix of pride and something softer. He looked vulnerable. He extended his hand, and Gail took it. Gail stepped down from the carriage onto the gravel path with the same decisiveness that marked all her actions. The nervous flutter in her stomach couldn't quite compete with the thrill of anticipation that danced up her spine. Here, surrounded by the vast expanse of sky and land, she felt the confines of societal expectations loosen their grip ever so slightly. Max watched her with those warm, inviting eyes, and she could tell he was gauging her reaction, wondering perhaps if she would be daunted by his parents and their home. But Gail was not one to shrink back. Instead, she squared her shoulders, ready to meet his parents. "It's beautiful, Max," Gail said, her voice clear and devoid of any pretense. "It has character, a story to tell." "Wait until you see the inside," Max replied, his usual businesslike tone taking on an edge of excitement. He led her up the steps, anticipation building inside him. As they reached the top, Gail paused, allowing herself a moment to drink in the view. The house was like something out of a dream, with its ornate windows and the welcoming sweep of the veranda. Yet it was the wide-open spaces that truly called to her, a landscape that promised freedom and echoed her own untamed spirit. "Come on," Max urged gently, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as if he enjoyed showing off his childhood domain. "Lead the way," Gail responded, her curiosity piqued. She stepped into the shade of the porch, feeling the slight reprieve from the sweltering heat outside. Max had scarcely knocked when the front door swung open to reveal a woman whose silver hair shimmered like moonlight on the prairie. Mrs. Carlson stood in the doorway, her spectacles catching a glint of sunlight as she beheld the pair with a smile. "Maxwell, my dear boy," she exclaimed, enveloping him in an embrace that left no doubt of the affection she held for him. Then, turning to Gail with arms still outstretched, she declared, "And you must be Gail. Come here, child, let me have a look at you." Gail stepped forward as Mrs. Carlson's hug enveloped her. She felt as if she was enclosed in love. "Welcome to our home," Mrs. Carlson said, releasing her and stepping aside to allow them entry. "Thank you, ma'am," Gail replied, her gaze flitting about as she crossed the threshold into a foyer that spoke of history and care. The walls were lined with paintings, frames gilded with the patina of age. Mrs. Carlson turned, leading the way. "Now, I must show you around. This house is full of memories, and I dare say you'll be part of them soon enough." They passed through hallways adorned with portraits, and Mrs. Carlson paused before one depicting a young Max, his eyes as bright and hopeful as they were today. "Look at this scamp," she chuckled, tapping the glass fondly. "Could climb any tree on the property but couldn't escape a bath to save his life." Gail laughed, imaging a younger Max with the same determined set to his jaw, even while covered in mud. "Sounds like he was quite the adventurer." "Still is," Mrs. Carlson confided with a wink. "But instead of trees, it's now business ventures. Always reaching for something just beyond his grasp." The twinkle in Max's eye told Gail that he didn't mind his mother talking about him that way. It was a side of him she hadn't seen, the boy within the man. And Gail felt a stirring of something deep within her chest, a connection to this house and its inhabitants that felt as natural as the rolling hills outside. "Come along," Mrs. Carlson beckoned, her voice rich with anticipation. "There's much more to see, and I believe the gardens will take your breath away." Gliding with the grace of a seasoned hostess, Mrs. Carlson reached for the ornate handle of the French doors and pushed them open, revealing the hidden heart of her domain. Gail followed, stepping across the threshold with the eagerness of a child. "Look, Mrs. Carlson said, her voice carrying the pride of one who has nurtured every leaf and bloom to perfection. The sight that was before Gail was one of such splendor that for a moment, she found herself bereft of words. The gardens were an explosion of colors, a living tapestry woven with the most exquisite threads nature could provide. Gail's gaze swept across the landscape, taking in the deep purples and vibrant yellows that danced under the relentless summer sun. "Good heavens," Gail murmured, her athletic form momentarily still as her senses tried to absorb the abundance around her. Her hands hung loosely by her side, fingers twitching slightly as if aching to touch and confirm the reality of such beauty. Mrs. Carlson, you have created a paradise, she said, finally finding her voice again, which carried a note of reverence reserved for places of worship. Mrs. Carlson beamed at the compliment, the lines on her face softening like well-worn paths in a lovingly tended garden. Thank you, dear. It is my solace and my sanctuary. Gail nodded, understanding the sentiment. She took a step forward, her eyes still wide in awe, and felt the subtle embrace of the garden's vitality wash over her. Shall we stroll? Mrs. Carlson suggested, her hand gesturing toward the mosaic of flowerbeds and greenery that lay ahead. Lead the way, Gail replied, her voice imbued with newfound warmth and excitement. Mrs. Carlson's voice broke the silence that had enveloped Gail since she entered the garden. This way, dear, she said, her spectacles catching the glint of sunlight as she led Gail down a cobblestone path edged with riotous blooms. Each flower has its tale, Mrs. Carlson continued, her words dancing on the warm breeze. The marigolds over there, she pointed to a vibrant cluster of orange and yellow, are hardy. Her eyes twinkled above the rim of her glasses. Gail listened intently, absorbing the stories woven into the tapestry of greenery. She admired the strength in Mrs. Carlson's voice. They meandered along the winding paths, the delicate scent of jasmine teasing their senses. Mrs. Carlson paused beside a bed of roses, their hues a spectrum ranging from the purest white to the deepest crimson. Ah, the queens of the garden, Mrs. Carlson declared with a flourish of her hand toward the roses. A bit thorny, but they wear their buds with elegance, don't you think? Gail reached out, her fingers grazing the softness of a particularly sumptuous bloom, a rose the color of sunset. Its velvety texture was a whisper against her skin. Simply exquisite, Gail murmured, her face was lit with an undisguised joy that made her eyes sparkle with the same vibrancy as the flowers before her. Aren't they? Agreed Mrs. Carlson, watching Gail with a knowing smile. It thrives here, because we dare to nurture it. Defiance can be quite beautiful, you see. Much like life itself, Gail responded. Gail followed Mrs. Carlson down a narrow flagstone path, her gaze capturing the flutter of delicate wings as they approached a small, secluded pond. The water's surface, dappled with the light filtering through the leaves above, shimmered like a sheet of glass. A solitary dragonfly, its iridescent body glinting in the sun, darted above the pond with precision, its aerial dance mesmerizing Gail. Dragonflies are the guardians of the water, Mrs. Carlson said. They keep the mosquitoes at bay and thus allow us to enjoy evenings by the pond without being pestered. Much like how the right company can ward off life's more difficult trials, Gail quipped, her straightforward manner blending seamlessly with the humor of the moment. A chuckle escaped Mrs. Carlson's lips. She seated herself on a weathered stone bench, patting the space beside her as an invitation for Gail to join. Max's father and I would spend hours out here, Mrs. Carlson began, her eyes reflecting the past as she spoke. He'd have his hands deep in the earth while I'd trim and prune. The garden was our sanctuary, a place where the world's expectations couldn't reach us. He doesn't move well enough to be out here much now, but he watches me from the window. She pointed toward the picture window that was seen from the sitting room, and there Mr. Carlson was, watching his wife and daughter-in-law as he spoke with Max. Sounds like he knows the value of hard work and tranquility, Gail responded, her tone revealing respect for the kind of self-sufficiency she too held dear. Oh, he does, Mrs. Carlson replied, a wistful smile playing upon her lips. He believes there is an honest simplicity in nurturing a garden. Much like raising children or building a life with someone, it requires patience, dedication, and not a small amount of defiance against life's relentless challenges. Defiance seems to be a recurring theme in this family, Gail said, her eyes momentarily tracing the path of the dragonfly as it continued its vigilant rounds. Perhaps it is, Mrs. Carlson conceded, her gaze turning back to Gail with an appraising look, but then again, sometimes that's precisely what one needs to flourish. With a sense of reverence for the tales Mrs. Carlson spun, Gail followed her through the maze of trimmed hedges and flowering shrubs. Your husband must be a remarkable man, Gail remarked, her voice a mere whisper, afraid to disturb the sacred stillness of the garden. Remarkable. And stubborn as the oaks, Mrs. Carlson chuckled softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You remind me of him in a way, there's a tenacity in you. It's refreshing. Gail felt a blush warm her cheeks, but she couldn't deny the swell of pride in her chest. To be likened to such a man by Max's own mother, it was an honor. They continued their stroll until the lush tapestry of greenery parted to reveal a hidden alcove. Nestled amidst the foliage sat a bench, its wooden slats worn smooth by countless seasons of contemplation. Here, away from the rest of the world, it seemed even time dared not intrude. "Let's rest a spell," Mrs. Carlson suggested with a gentle wave towards the bench. Eager for a moment's reprieve, Gail settled onto the seat, relishing the sturdy embrace of the wood against her back. The surrounding flora thrived in quiet defiance of the harsh Texas sun, offering a refuge from the summer heat. A soft breeze caressed Gail's face, and she closed her eyes. "Max told me about your knack for fixing things," Mrs. Carlson said after a moment, her tone casual but curious. "I'm sure that will come in handy at the hotel." "Jack of all trades, master of none," Gail replied, opening her eyes to meet the older woman's gaze. "But I've always believed that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing with your own two hands." "Spoken like a true Carlson," Mrs. Carlson murmured approvingly. "This land, this house, it's more than just soil and timber. It's a testament to what can be achieved when one refuses to bow to life's whims." "Mrs. Carlson," she said, "I cannot thank you enough for welcoming me into your home and, most importantly, into this enchanting garden. It's clear that every flower and blade of grass here has been tended with love." Mrs. Carlson's lips curved into a smile, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of nurturing not unlike the gardens she so cherished. She stepped closer to Gail, her gait as graceful as the dance of the dragonflies skimming the pond's surface. "Dear child," Mrs. Carlson said in a voice seasoned with the sweet cadence of the South, "to share the beauty of this place is a joy in itself. But to see it appreciated by someone with a heart as open as yours, that is a gift beyond measure." With a touch as gentle as the breeze that stirred the climbing roses, Mrs. Carlson placed her hand on Gail's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes, bridging generations and sealing an unspoken pact between them, a kinship rooted in a shared admiration for the wilds that sprawled before them. Gail looked up, meeting Mrs. Carlson's gaze, and saw reflected there not only understanding but also a hint of mischief, as though she too had once defied convention in pursuit of her passions. In that moment, Gail felt the threads of her own defiant spirit weave seamlessly with the tapestry of the Carlson legacy. "Then I shall endeavor to be worthy of such a gift," Gail replied, her words echoing her resolve to honor this bond, to nurture it as Mrs. Carlson did her beloved garden, and perhaps, to watch it bloom into something truly magnificent. Mrs. Carlson joined Gail on the bench, a relic of iron and wood that had witnessed countless seasons unfurl in this tenderly kept corner of the world. Mrs. Carlson tucked her skirt neatly beneath her, while Gail perched with an air of thoughtful repose, the afternoon sun casting dappled shadows upon her strong features. "Isn't it something?" Mrs. Carlson murmured, gesturing to the expanse of greenery that surrounded them. "How nature conspires to create such harmony." "It is," Gail agreed, her gaze meandering through the intricate floral arrangements, each petal and leaf a testament to patient artistry. "It's like a painting that breathes and grows, quite contrary to its own rules." "Ah, but the best things in life often do," Mrs. Carlson chuckled softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "They defy expectation and often, propriety." Gail's lips quirked upward at the word, propriety. She knew well the weight of societal norms, having danced around them all her life. "I've found that propriety sometimes wears a rather dull dress," she said. "Nature prefers a gown of many colors." "Max certainly inherited his mother's wisdom," Gail added, her tone laced with affection for the man who had brought her to this unexpected sanctuary. She thought of Max, the quiet strength in his gaze, and how he too seemed to stand apart from the rigid lines drawn by the hands of polite society. Mrs. Carlson nodded. "Oh, my dear, how we both used to scandalize the neighbors," she confided with a mischievous glint. "However, in our defense, the roses never complained about our discourse, nor did the jasmine recoil from our laughter." "Perhaps they understood better than most," Gail said. "Perhaps," Mrs. Carlson agreed. As the light began to wane, so too did the distance between past and present, between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. They sat, not merely as two individuals brought together by circumstance, but as kindred spirits. "Thank you, Mrs. Carlson," Gail said after a time, her words imbued with sincerity. "For this, for everything." "Call me Rebecca, dear," Mrs. Carlson replied with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "After all, we are family now." Gail swept through the spacious kitchen with a practiced ease, her arms laden with platters of chilled meats, cheeses, and fresh fruits that Rebecca had arranged with impeccable care. The heat of a Texan summer evening lingered, and the coolness of the supper spread promised a welcome respite. As she placed the food on the long wooden table, Gail felt the anticipation of the meal mingle with a flutter of nerves. She had yet to meet Mr. Carlson, Max's father. She turned to find Rebecca carrying out a pitcher of lemonade. "Now don't you fret, Gail," Rebecca said, reading the tension in Gail's posture. "Mr. Carlson's bark is worse than his bite." "Thank you, Rebecca. I'm sure it will be fine," Gail replied, though her hands betrayed her by fussing over the already perfect placement of the silverware. As they settled at the table, the sound of footsteps drew their attention. Max led an older man onto the veranda, his arm linked with an air of filial respect. Mr. Carlson emerged into view, a striking mirror to Max, if one could imagine him weathered by years and wisdom. His hair, peppered with gray, lent him a distinguished look that Gail was certain Max would inherit. "Father, this is Gail," Max introduced, gesturing toward where she stood. She extended a hand. "Delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Carlson," she said, her voice projecting the confidence she willed herself to feel. "Likewise, Gail," he replied, his handshake conveying both strength and refinement. His eyes, sharp and assessing, seemed to take her measure in a single glance. They all took their seats, quiet filling the room as plates were passed and glasses filled. Mr. Carlson cleared his throat, a prelude to speech that immediately captured the table's attention. "I must apologize for not joining you in the garden earlier," he said, his tone formal but tinged with something softer. "But I must confess, having Max to myself for a brief spell was a rare treat." Max nodded, his smile acknowledging the private moment shared between father and son. Gail observed the subtle interplay of glances between them, the unspoken understanding that spoke volumes of their relationship, a partnership solidified by mutual respect and the weight of legacy. "Understandable, sir," Gail said, sharing a knowing look with Max. "I believe moments like those are to be cherished." "I concur," Mr. Carlson agreed, his eyes warming slightly as he regarded her anew. As the laughter from a well-told story by Mr. Carlson began to fade, Gail found herself watching the family with a sense of wonderment. It was in the way Mrs. Carlson's eyes twinkled when she looked at her husband, the soft wrinkles around her mouth evidence of many years spent smiling, and in the gentle manner Mr. Carlson's hand found its way atop his wife's, an unspoken promise of enduring partnership. "Pass the bread, if you'd be so kind," Mrs. Carlson requested, her voice carrying the melodious lilt of long-held affection. "Of course, ma'am," Gail responded, handing over the basket with a steady hand that belied the fluttering in her chest. As the meal continued, she observed the Carlsons with a mixture of awe and something deeper, more poignant. Never had Gail sat at a table where the air was so thick with familial ties, where every shared glance and quiet chuckle wove a tapestry of intimacy she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. The orphanage had provided camaraderie and care, but this sense of unity was a foreign concept to her. "Gail, you've grown rather quiet," Mr. Carlson observed, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "I hope our stories haven't bored you into silence." Gail shook her head, her lips curving into a smile that reached her eyes. "Not at all, sir. It's just, I was thinking how lovely it is to see a family enjoy each other's company so thoroughly." "Family is the compass that guides us," Mrs. Carlson remarked, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "They are the inspiration to reach great heights and our comfort when we occasionally falter." "I see," Gail murmured. She glanced across the table at Max, who offered her an encouraging nod, as if he understood the stirrings of her heart. In that instant, a profound realization settled upon Gail, a realization both sweet and startling in its clarity. For the first time in her life, she was in the presence of what felt like true parents. Her independent spirit, always so quick to stand alone against the world, now basked in the warmth of kinship. Parents, the word echoed in her mind, not with the longing of an orphaned child, but with the thrill of a young woman who had stumbled upon a treasure she hadn't even known she sought. The Carlsons, with their genteel manners and hearty laughter, had unwittingly filled a void within her, offering a semblance of the parental guidance she had never experienced. The evening wore on, and Gail's heart swelled with a newfound joy. Yes, she thought, if life were to grant her the privilege of choosing those to call mother and father, she would wish for no others than the couple before her, and while the ties that bound them were not of blood, they were, perhaps, of something even stronger: respect, affection, and a sense of belonging. With a contented sigh, Gail joined in the conversation once more, her words flowing more freely now, infused with the lightness that comes from a spirit unburdened. In the company of the Carlsons, she found a piece of the home she never knew she'd been missing. Chapter 4. Gail worked in the laundry of the hotel the following morning, folding linens, which was not work she loved, but at least it got her outside to hang the sheets. She had just finished all the sheets for the day, and was getting ready to go back outside for the restaurant's tablecloths, when she spotted her sister Cassandra. She looked at her with surprise. There must be something wrong, or Cassandra would be at home, working on her next dress. "What is it?" she asked, worried. Cassandra frowned. "Amy's sick. Brenda is staying with her, but she needs the rest of us too." Gail nodded immediately. "Of course." She called to one of the maids that had been working beside her. "You'll need to finish alone. My sister is ill." When the maid nodded, Gail hurried off to Max's office, to tell him what was wrong. She stopped short, realizing Cassandra was following her. "Go. I'll get there as quickly as I can." Cassandra nodded. "Thank you." "Of course. She's family." Gail rushed to Max's office, explaining what was wrong quickly. "Max," Gail said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil brewing within. "I need to go to her." Max stood and embraced Gail. His brows knit in concern, not for the disruption of their daily life, but for the well-being of his sister-in-law. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "Take the buggy." "And Gail," he paused, searching for the right words amidst the gravity of the moment, "make certain she's all right." "Thank you." Gail's response was curt, not from lack of affection, but from the urgency pressing upon her heart. With a final glance at the packed satchel, she lifted it and strode purposefully toward the door. "I can't remember her ever being sick. And she has 4 children to take care of." Gail hitched the horse to the buggy with practiced ease, her movements swift and certain. There was no room for doubt or delay. They were sisters, and they would always help one another. She climbed aboard, urging the horse forward with a gentle flick of the reins. The buggy jostled over the uneven terrain, the wheels kicking up clouds of dust that lingered in the air. Gail drove with an intensity that matched the pounding of her heart. As the ranch came into view, a rush of resolve surged through Gail. She would face this trial with the same determination that had seen her through countless others. Her love for her family would guide her through whatever awaited. Gail's fingers danced along the rough bark, finding purchase in the grooves of the ancient oak. With a hammer hanging from her belt and nails clenched between her teeth, she scaled the tree with the ease of a seasoned woodsman. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Gail was undeterred. She had promised to build this treehouse for the younger ones. Below, her sisters moved like parts of a well-oiled machine, each fulfilling their role within the family unit. Some tended the vegetable patch, coaxing life from the parched earth, while others laundered clothes, the fabric snapping in the hot wind like flags of defiance against hardship. Brenda was the one inside the house tending to Amy, feeling that was the way she could help the best. Brenda was a little dictator at times, telling the rest of them what they should do. Sturdy as a fortress, Gail muttered to herself as she measured and sawed planks with precision born of necessity. But a shadow fell across her mirth as her gaze drifted toward the house where Amy lay ill. Gail could sense the severity of the silence that hung over the ranch, a stark contrast to the usual clatter of life within its walls. "Hey, Gail!" Erna called up from below, shielding her eyes from the sun's glare. "You think she'll pull through?" "Of course, she will," Gail replied, more confidently than she felt. The words were a talisman meant to ward off her creeping dread. She'll be back on her feet in no time. Hope you're right, Ernest said, her voice betraying a hint of her own worry beneath the sass. Hope has nothing to do with it, Gail shot back with a forced grin, driving a nail home with an emphatic thwack. It's a matter of will, and Amy's got plenty of that. But as Gail returned to her task, her shoulders tensed, betraying the concern that furrowed her brow. Each strike of the hammer echoed her racing thoughts, her mind a tumult of what-ifs and prayers for her sister's swift recovery. Keep busy, keep focused, she whispered to herself, knowing full well that action was her only refuge from fear. And so, she built, pouring her energy into the creation of something good and solid. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Fort Worth sky with streaks of orange and purple, Gail would hang up her tool belt, its leather worn from years of faithful service. With a sigh that carried the weight of the day's labor, she'd wipe the sweat from her brow, leaving a smudge of sawdust across her forehead, a badge of her toil. Time to head back, she'd murmur to herself, her voice tinged with determination. Turning her back on the skeletal frame of the treehouse that seemed to reach out for her retreating form, Gail made her way to the buggy, where her trusty mare awaited. With practiced ease, she climbed aboard, giving the reins a gentle flick. The horse knew the path well. It was trodden each evening with the same faithful regularity as the ticking of a clock. As Gail approached the home she shared with Max, the outline of the hotel came into view. She felt the contrast acutely, the rugged builder by day, transformed by nightfall into a wife whose heart longed for the solace of her husband's arms. Upon her arrival, Max would be there to greet her, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Another day of conquests, he'd tease. Something like that, Gail would reply, mustering a weary smile as she stepped down from the buggy. Despite the fatigue that clung to her like the dust on her clothes, she found herself energized in the simple act of returning home to him. Once they were in their rooms on the top floor of the hotel, Max would recount tales from the restaurant, animatedly describing the day's challenges with a chef who burnt the soup or a customer who sent back a perfectly good steak. "And how did you fare against the forces of nature?" he'd ask, turning the conversation to her endeavors with sincere interest. She would share her progress, her words painting pictures of the treehouse taking shape, its wooden bones promising sanctuary to young imaginations. Sometimes, though, her voice would falter as she spoke of Amy, her worry seeping through the facade of confidence. Max would listen, his presence a steady anchor, and when she finished speaking, he'd reach across the table to take her calloused hand in his. "She's got all of you, Gail. And if anyone can pull through, she will, just to get all of you to stay home and let her be with her family in peace." Gail smiled, thankful he was so positive, even though she was leaving him every day. "Thank you." Gail was thankful that she could shed the skin of the builder and allow herself to be just Gail, Max's wife, who cherished the quiet moments spent in the company of the man she loved. Gail wiped the sweat from her brow, leaving a smudge of earth across her sun-kissed cheek. The day had been a long one, spent tending to Amy's garden, coaxing life from the soil as if willing her sister's recovery with every plant she nurtured. Despite the fatigue that clung to her like the dirt under her fingernails, Gail mustered a smile as she stepped off the elevator and through the doorway of the rooms she shared with Max. Evening, Max called from where he stood over the table, which was filled with their evening meal, furnished by the restaurant. "Evening," Gail echoed, her tone light as she leaned against the doorframe. She observed him for a moment, thankful that he had supper waiting for her. "Smells like heaven in here," she said, closing the distance between them to peck his cheek. "Or is that just your natural scent?" Max chuckled, a rich sound that filled the room. "If sweat and rosemary are what heaven smells like, then I suppose it might be." "Ah, the sweet bouquet of honest work," Gail said, washing up at the basin. They fell into an easy rhythm. Max uncovered their meals, while Gail set the table. They sat down to eat, and Gail regaled Max with tales of her day, the stubborn weeds, the relentless sun, and the scarecrow that seemed to have developed a personality all its own. Yet, even as mirth danced in her eyes, shadows of tiredness etched faint lines upon her face. Max caught the subtle signs, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the slight slump of her shoulders as the energy waned from her stories. "Are you sure you don't want to rest tomorrow, Gail? You've been at it non-stop." Max's concern laced his words, his gaze steady upon her. She shook her head, determination knitting her brows. I can't. I need to be with my sisters while Amy is ill, and that garden won't tend itself. It's not just about the plants. It's about bringing a piece of normalcy back to her, something alive and growing. Your strength astounds me, Max said softly, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. But remember, you needn't carry this burden alone. Gail sighed, a weary acceptance in the sound. I know, Max. But this is something I have to do. For Amy, for myself. As dinner concluded and they retreated to the parlor, Gail leaned into Max, allowing herself the luxury of resting her head upon his shoulder. Here, in the quiet intimacy of their shared silence, she found respite from the day's labors, a gentle reprieve that bolstered her spirit for the challenges yet to come. Gail's hands were stained with soil, and the scent of fresh earth clung to her like a second skin. You look about ready to fall over, Max remarked with a twinkle in his eye. Perhaps, Gail conceded with a tired smile, but it's a good sort of exhaustion, if there is such a thing. The kind that comes from doing something worthwhile. Max approached her. He took her dirt-smeared hands into his own. You've been a pillar, Gail. Tending to Amy's garden, making sure she has that bit of normalcy. It means the world to her, I know, she nodded, feeling the weight of her efforts in her bones, but also the warmth of his praise in her heart. It's only what any sister would do. I appreciate you letting me go and be with her and her family. Consider it my pleasure, he said earnestly. It's not every day I get to manage a hotel and make sure the maids get the linens clean all at once. She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. Brenda says Amy is improving. As dusk rolled in, Gail and Max sat together on the porch, 2 cups of chamomile tea steaming in the twilight. They spoke of the day's triumphs and trials. Tomorrow, I'll come with you, Max said unexpectedly, breaking the comfortable silence. I can help in the garden, and maybe take a look at that fence. Max, you don't have to, Gail began, but he raised a hand to gently halt her protests. I want to, he insisted. Amy's your family, which makes her my family too. We're in this together, remember? Remember? How could I forget with you reminding me at every turn, Gail asked softly, though her eyes shone with gratitude. Then it's settled, Max declared with a decisive nod. But it appears the next morning his parents arrive. Did you intentionally skip him going to Amy's? Chapter 5. Max Carlson's eyes snapped open as the sun was coming up, like they did every morning. The weight of the day's duties pressed upon him. With a resolve as unwavering as the sturdy beams of his family's hotel, he swung his legs out from under the crisp sheets and planted his feet firmly on the floor. Today, like any other, promised no respite for a man of his station. He was the master of schedules, the keeper of keys, the last word in an empire of hospitality. And so, Max began his rounds, just as the world outside stirred to life. He descended from his private quarters to the bustling heart of the hotel. Max's keen eyes swept through the premises, missing not a speck of dust nor a thread out of place. Morning, Mr. Carlson, greeted Sarah, the front desk attendant, her voice a cheerful melody against the hum of early risers. Good morning, Sarah. Have we received any special requests from our guests for today? Max asked, adjusting the stack of neatly folded newsletters on the counter as he spoke. Only the usual, sir. Fresh flowers for room 204 and an extra pillow for the gentleman in 307, she reported dutifully, her pen poised over the logbook. Excellent. See to it that they are delivered promptly, he instructed, nodding with approval at her meticulous notes. In the dining room, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the promise of a hearty breakfast. Max surveyed the preparations, a general inspecting his troops before battle. The clatter of silverware being set and the sizzle from the kitchen created a symphony of readiness. Max, all burners are firing, and the biscuits are just about ready to be taken out of the oven, Chef Lewis said. Let's ensure they make a grand entrance, then, Max replied, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Our guests do appreciate your theatrics with the pastries. Nothing but the best for them, you know that, the chef said. With every step, every interaction, Max wove himself further into the tapestry of the hotel's daily life. He was both the anchor that kept it grounded and the compass that steered its course. His was a dance of checks and balances, each twirl and dip executed with precision. Yet, despite the gravity of his role, there was an ease to his manner. For Max did not merely run a hotel. He breathed life into it. Max continued his rounds, the very embodiment of diligence wrapped in the casual charm of a seasoned host. Every staff member felt his presence, a guiding force that propelled them forward, ensuring that within these walls, everything ran like clockwork. Max had barely rounded the corner when the unmistakable scent of burnt toast wafted through the air, a harbinger of mischief in the otherwise well-oiled machine of the hotel kitchen. He strode across the black and white checkered floor, his keen eyes already surveying the scene before him. "Seems we have a bit of a situation," Max said, his voice calm, despite the minor chaos erupting around him. "Apologies, Mr. Carlson," the sous chef replied, cheeks flushed from the heat and the hiccup in their morning routine. "It just fell off the toasting fork. The smell will dissipate soon, and I already have more bread toasting." "The smell is a bit dramatic," Max said with a hint of mirth, though his mind was already ticking through solutions. "Let's keep our guests from thinking they've booked a stay in Pompeii, shall we?" "Let's carry on," Max instructed, the command delivered with a reassuring smile that eased the tension in the room. No sooner had order been restored than the front doors swung open, heralding the arrival of two figures whose mere presence seemed to lighten the very air. Mr. and Mrs. Carlson stepped into the fray of the bustling hotel. "Maxwell," Mrs. Carlson called out, her voice soft yet carrying, as she caught sight of her son across the lobby. "Mother," Max responded, the formality of his tone giving way to affection as he crossed the distance to envelop his parents in an embrace. "Father," he added, nodding respectfully. "We thought we'd come see how you're faring, son," Mr. Carlson said, his eyes scanning the surroundings with an appraiser's precision. "It appears the hotel is thriving under your care, thanks to a good team and a decent amount of luck," Max replied, though his grateful gaze toward his parents revealed the depth of his appreciation for their timely support. "Let's hope it's more skill than luck," Mrs. Carlson chimed in, her eyes twinkling with pride. Max led his parents into the sequestered calm of the hotel's office. They settled into chairs that had been witnesses to many a late-night ledger review and strategy session. The atmosphere, though tinged with familial warmth, was heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of the day's agenda. "Maxwell, you're doing an exceptional job," Mr. Carlson began, casting a discerning gaze around the room that held the very essence of their family's legacy. "This place has never looked better." "Thank you, Father," Max replied, his posture straightening under the weight of both pride and responsibility. "But it's not without its trials." "Which is precisely why we're here," Mrs. Carlson interjected, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "To talk through these trials of yours." Max sighed, a fleeting shadow passing across his features as he contemplated the breadth of challenges before him. He spoke of occupancy rates and event bookings, of supply chain disruptions, and the unwavering Texas heat that tested even the hardiest of guests. "There seems to be no end to the hurdles," he concluded, a furrow etching itself between his brows. "And with Gail helping her sister, I don't even have her to rely on." "Which brings us to our suggestion," Mr. Carlson stated, cutting through the air of concern with a decisiveness that Max knew all too well. "Mother, Father, I'm not sure I'm ready to hear." "Maxwell," Mrs. Carlson cut in gently, her voice firm but kind, "you've been burning the candle at both ends. It might be time to consider hiring a manager for the restaurant." Max bristled at the proposition. "I can manage," he insisted, the words staunch but his tone betraying a hint of exhaustion. It's what I do." "Son, no one doubts your capabilities," his father reassured. "But there's no need for you to run yourself ragged by doing everything on your own." Max leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the shifting weight of his contemplation. The idea of relinquishing any part of the enterprise, however small, seemed tantamount to admitting defeat. "Father, Mother, I appreciate your counsel," Max said after a moment, his eyes locked onto theirs. "But this place, it's not just a business. It's where I grew up. It's part of who I am. To hand over even a piece of it." "Maxwell," Mrs. Carlson said softly, reaching out to lay a comforting hand atop his. Your father and we built this from the ground up so that it would stand the test of time. Not just on our backs, but on the strength of all those who'd take up the mantle after us. Letting someone help you isn't a sign of weakness, Mr. Carlson added, it's an act of trust. And wisdom. Perhaps, Max conceded, though the word came out more sigh than assent. His mind raced with the implications, the potential relinquishment of control, the admission that he, too, had his limits. Think on it, son, his mother encouraged. You have a legacy to uphold, true, but you also have a future to build. And sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do is to reach out when the burden grows heavy. Max nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a reluctant smile. His parents' words, though difficult to accept, carried the weight of experience and love, a combination that was hard to refute. Max stood by the window, watching the Fort Worth sun cast long shadows over the courtyard of his family's hotel. The early morning light did little to ease the furrow in his brow, a physical testament to the night's restless contemplation. Your grandfather was much like you, headstrong and solitary in his ways, Mr. Carlson said. But even he recognized when the hour had come to share the yoke. And I, Mrs. Carlson chimed in, her voice a soothing lilt in the quiet room, was that first helping hand he accepted. It was not mere assistance, it was partnership. Partnership, Max echoed thoughtfully, rolling the word around as if tasting it for the first time. There was a certain allure to the concept, a promise of shared burdens and multiplied joys. Yes, his father said. To delegate is not to surrender, Maxwell. It's to empower yourself and others. Max could almost see it, the hotel running like clockwork, the restaurant abuzz with satisfied patrons, and him. Not shouldering it all alone. Very well, Max declared, the spark of resolve igniting within him. I shall seek out such a partner post-haste. With newfound determination, he retreated to his desk, the mahogany surface soon strewn with papers as he drafted the job description. His pen moved with precision, each stroke deliberate, outlining the ideal candidate, experienced yet adaptable, stern yet personable, someone who could command the kitchen and charm the guests in equal measure. Must be adept at navigating the intricacies of hospitality management, Max said as he wrote, able to withstand the blazing Texas summers with a smile, and possess an innate understanding of our clientele's diverse palates. Once satisfied with the crafted prose, Max set about posting advertisements in the local paper. Attention to detail. Unwavering commitment. A touch of humor in the face of adversity, he listed the qualities aloud, envisioning the paragon of managerial virtue that would soon walk through their doors. In the hours that followed, Max's meticulous nature did not wane. He organized his office, aligning ledgers and reservation books as if each were a soldier in formation, ready to welcome the reinforcements. With every tick of the clock, anticipation grew. Not just for assistance, but for the advent of a new era in the storied history of the Carlson family business. Mother, father, Max said later that day, finding them in their garden beneath the shade of an old oak, the search has commenced. Soon, we shall find the one who will help carry our legacy forward. His parents exchanged a knowing glance, pride evident in their smiles. We have no doubt, Mrs. Carlson replied, her voice warm as the afternoon sun. Nor do we fear for the future, added Mr. Carlson, clapping a firm hand on Max's shoulder. For we know the blood of entrepreneurs runs strong in your veins. Max settled into the leather chair behind his desk with a sense of purpose. The stack of letters before him was as varied as the patrons who passed through their doors, each one promising skills and experiences as diverse as the menu in the restaurant downstairs. First impressions are crucial, he murmured to himself, straightening a pile of papers with an exacting flick of his wrist. The parade of candidates was punctual, each allocated a precise 15 minutes in which to persuade Max of their suitability for the role. He greeted them with a firm handshake, his warm eyes scanning their posture, attire, and demeanor even before they took their seats. A young woman named Samantha presented herself first, her poise speaking of experience beyond her years. She spoke of streamlining processes and how she'd turned around restaurants that were failing. Max appreciated her ambition, jotting down notes about her potential fit. Then came Thomas, a burly man with hands like bare paws that had likely seen more labor than finesse. His laugh boomed through the room as he regaled Max with stories of diffusing tense situations in busy establishments. Despite his jovial nature, there was a shrewdness in his eyes that Max respected. Following him was Anne, her eagerness almost palpable. She fidgeted with her skirt as she pitched fresh ideas with the fervency of someone who had studied the theory but lacked the experience. Max admired her passion but noted the need for practical knowledge. With each candidate, Max's questions cut to the heart of the matter: what would you do if, and how have you handled? He listened intently, searching for the thread of adaptability and poise that the role demanded. After the interviews, Max reviewed his notes. There were strong contenders indeed, but only a select few resonated with the ethos he held dear. He scheduled second interviews for Samantha, whose efficiency could reinvigorate their service, and Thomas, who might safeguard the familial atmosphere with his robust laughter. And, he decided, deserved a chance to prove that her theories could withstand the heat of the kitchen. Specifics, he said to himself, planning the next round of interviews. We'll delve into the specifics. Max prepared a list of scenarios tailored to reveal each candidate's true compatibility with the hotel's culture. He imagined how they might navigate the ebb and flow of a bustling dining room or resolve conflicts in a manner befitting the Carlson legacy. The coming conversations would require a delicate balance between cordiality and scrutiny. Progress, Max acknowledged with a nod, as he placed the chosen resumes on top of the pile. He felt a burgeoning camaraderie with these strangers who might soon become part of the intricate tapestry of the hotel's daily life. Mother and father were right, he concluded, the lingering heat of the Texas summer filtering through the office blinds. One must build a team to construct a future. Max hovered over the final application spread across his mahogany desk, fingers drumming a steady beat. He drew in a deep breath, exhaling the weight of indecision that had perched upon his shoulders for days. Samantha, he murmured, her resume atop the stack, you're it. He carefully wrote out a letter, offering her the position of restaurant manager. 2 days later, Max found his parents seated on the veranda. Mr. Carlson looked up from his newspaper, while Mrs. Carlson set aside her knitting, her eyes filled with interest. Mother, father, Max began, unable to keep the triumph from his tone, I've hired our new assistant manager, Samantha Bennett. Is that so? Mr. Carlson rumbled, folding the paper with a crisp snap. Well done, son. We knew you would find the right person. Mrs. Carlson's face creased into a smile of pure joy, her eyes reflecting pride more radiant than the setting sun. Oh, Max, we are so proud of you. Your father and I always believed in your judgment. I hope to lead with the same wisdom you've bestowed upon me, Max said. Chapter 6. Gail and Max settled into the worn but comfortable armchairs in their cozy sitting room. A soft breeze drifted in from the open window, doing little to alleviate the persistent summer heat that enveloped Fort Worth. Max, Gail began, her voice carrying the ease of the outdoors, Amy's finally better. She's turned the corner. No need for me to ride back to the ranch anymore. Max regarded her with a gentle nod, his warm eyes reflecting genuine concern. That's good to hear, Gail. I can't say how happy I am to have you back with me all the time. Gail leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, her gaze earnest and unwavering. I think we've been talking around a lot of subjects since we got married, but I'd like to speak plainly. Plain speaking's what I value most, Max admitted, his own posture mirroring hers as he leaned in, the light casting shadows across his determined face. We've both got dreams we're trying to make come true. What is it you're chasing, Gail? Freedom, she said without hesitation. The kind that comes with wide-open spaces and breathing in fresh air. Max listened, his expression softening. My fears aren't that different. I lie awake at night, wondering if I'll ever fill my parents' shoes, or if I'll watch their legacy crumble. He paused, his voice growing quieter. And then there's the fear of loneliness, of building an empire with nobody to share it with. Loneliness is a silent thief, Gail agreed, her eyes meeting his, a pair of souls undressing their guarded hearts. But we aren't alone, are we, Max? Not truly. We've got each other. For better or for worse. Max's chuckle broke the tension, light and free as the wind that tousled his hair. Seems like being married to you might just be the start of something worth breaking a few rules for. Breaking rules? Gail's laugh joined his. Why, Mr. Carlson, are you suggesting we defy the very societal norms that keep a lady and gentleman at arm's length? Perhaps I am, he teased, the corners of his lips curving upward in a smile that reached his eyes. After all, when has either of us ever been one to walk the line drawn by others? Never, she declared, her spirit alight with the thrill of shared rebellion. And I don't intend to start now. Gail shifted in her seat, her gaze lingered on Max, who sat across from her, his hands folded as if to cradle the weight of his world, the hotel and restaurant that was both his burden and his pride. Max, she said, I've watched you pour your heart and soul into this place. The way you handle every little crisis with such grit, well, it's downright admirable. You've got ambition enough to fill the Trinity River, and yet you never let it spill over and drown the rest of us. A flicker of surprise softened the lines of concern that often marked his brow. His lips parted, but no words came at first, only a grateful nod. He cleared his throat, ready to match her candor with his own. Truth be told, Gail, I'm equally taken by how you tackle every challenge head-on. Be it a stubborn nail or the hotel's laundry, you've got a knack for setting things right. Max's eyes twinkled with genuine admiration. It's refreshing. She blushed, though whether it was from the compliment or the Texas heat, even she couldn't say. A strand of hair escaped its confines, and she tucked it behind her ear. Never thought I'd hear a man appreciate my practical skills over a plate of my cooking, she said with a playful tilt of her head. But I think we're both full of surprises. And of course, no man has ever appreciated my imaginary cooking skills. He grinned. We'll have to eat your cooking again one day, he said, his tone light but laden with an unspoken promise. We make a good team. Growing up at the foundling home, Gail said, it wasn't all chores and lessons. We had our moments, like the time we turned the laundry line into our own private circus act. A smirk played on her lips as she recalled the memory. I was the ringleader, of course, balancing along the ropes while trying to juggle apples stolen from the kitchen. Max chuckled, clearly picturing the scene. Bet that ended with more than one bruised ego, and apple. More like a bruised behind when I took a tumble, she admitted with a rueful grin. But it taught me something vital, how to fall without losing my spirit or my sense of humor. Sounds like a valuable life lesson, he said. Indeed. And what about you, Max? Any childhood capers you'd care to share? Gail asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Max leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Well, there was one summer, he said, a mischievous glint in his eye, when I fancied myself a bit of an entrepreneur. Decided to create a hotel for the local critters. Built tiny rooms out of cardboard and charged the neighborhood kids a nickel to book a stay for their pets. You did? Gail laughed. Yep, until the Carlson critter and met its untimely demise. Turns out, cats and dogs aren't too keen on sharing quarters, especially not Mr. Jenkins's tomcat and the miller's hound. His smile widened. Chaos ensued, guests checked out early, and refunds were demanded. Ah, the trials and tribulations of hospitality management start young, she said, laughter filling her voice. Guess they do, Max agreed, his own laughter mingling with hers. That debacle might have been my first taste of the business, but look at me now, running a real hotel and restaurant, without a single disgruntled feline or canine to speak of. Perhaps that early failure was a stroke of luck, Gail said, her gaze softening. It led you here, to this place. And I think you're doing a mighty fine job. Thanks to people like you, he said earnestly. Your support. It means the world to me, Gail. Max reached out to her. His fingers brushed a wayward strand of Gail's blonde hair back behind her ear. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of unspoken affection, stirring in Gail an unexpected sensation, a shiver that cascaded down her spine. Sorry, Max murmured, his voice a low rumble, it was just tickling your cheek. Gail, her breath caught in the sudden stillness of the cozy room, turned her gaze towards Max. Thank you, she said, her voice a whisper. Her words were not merely for his gallantry in rescuing her from the ticklish assault of her own hair, but for all he had become to her. In that fleeting exchange, where no grand declarations were made nor any monumental promises exchanged, there existed a profound truth. Gail found herself cherishing the notion of partnership, of sharing the load with someone like Max. And Max recognized in Gail a kindred spirit, someone whose practicality and zest for life matched his own. Time seemed to pause as Gail and Max shared a moment of silence. Their eyes remained locked, a cascade of emotion swirling within them. The air was thick with all the things they wanted to say but didn't need to, their gazes conveyed volumes more than words ever could. Max's brow softened as he took in Gail's earnest expression. He marveled at how her presence filled the room, not just with her laughter and her boundless energy, but with an intangible warmth that he'd grown to crave. Slowly, as if being drawn by a force greater than themselves, Max leaned in, his intent clear in the deliberate pace of his actions. His breath ghosted over her lips, a prelude to the moment their worlds would collide. And then, their lips met. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a declaration, tender yet full of passion, as if they were both pouring every ounce of their growing love into the connection. Max's hand cradled her cheek, a silent vow of his affection, while Gail's heart galloped like a Mustang across the open plains, wild and free. Gail's heart, still racing from their kiss, found a new rhythm as they parted. They lingered close together, foreheads touching. The warmth from Max's skin seeped into hers, mingling with her body heat. In the quiet aftermath of laughter and confessions, Gail's hand sought Max's, her movements deliberate, unhesitant, as if her spirit recognized its counterpart. Their fingers intertwined, a tangible testament to the trust and camaraderie that had grown roots deep within them. "Your hands," Max observed, tracing the lines of calluses on her palm with a fingertip, "they speak of so many stories. I can picture you building a treehouse." "And yours," Gail returned, exploring the rough texture of his own, "tell of hard work and a dedication that's rare." They remained thus, entwined and content, reveling in the comfort and security that seemed to hum through their joined hands. It was as though each pulse that passed between them knitted their lives closer together, stitch by intricate stitch. And in that moment, Gail felt a profound sense of belonging, a certainty that with Max, she'd found not just a love, but a partner in every sense of the word. Gail shifted closer to Max, her shoulder brushing his as they settled into the snug recesses of the sofa. "Tell me," she said, her tone light yet laden with genuine curiosity, "what's the grandest dream for your hotel and restaurant?" Max's eyes gleamed in the twilight. "To make it a place where travelers talk about their stay for years to come. To build a legacy that's more than just brick and mortar," he said, his voice a mixture of resolve and wistfulness. "Like an oasis in this Texas heat, huh?" Gail mused, a playful smile dancing upon her lips. "A haven for weary souls." "Exactly," he chuckled, clearly pleased by her understanding. "And you? What are your aspirations beyond these wide-open spaces?" Her gaze wandered past the window to the sprawling expanse beyond. "I've always fancied building something of my own," she confessed, "a place where kids like I was can learn more than just how to get by, how to thrive." "An admirable pursuit," Max acknowledged, nodding thoughtfully, as he visualized the future Gail painted with her words. "Time seems to stand still when I'm with you," Gail noted, her hand squeezing Max's gently. "Or perhaps it's we who stand still while the world rushes on," Max replied, his thumb caressing the back of her hand in absent-minded affection. Hours slipped away unnoticed, the mantel clock ticking away moments neither paid heed to. It was as if the very hands of time grew sluggish, reluctant to interrupt the burgeoning bond between them. "Seems like the stars have stolen the stage from the sun," Max remarked, gesturing toward the window. "Then let's be grateful to the night for giving us this time," Gail replied, her voice a soft murmur that held the weight of newfound affection. Chapter 7. The sweltering Texas summer had done little to wilt the spirits of Gail, who found herself standing on the porch of Hortense Blakely's quaint herbalist cottage. Her gaze swept across the wild tangle of marigolds and lavender that hemmed in the walkway, a prelude to the botanical wonder that awaited her within. Brenda, in her characteristic manner, rapped twice on the wooden door, a grin playing at the corners of her mouth. Brenda had suggested they spend the afternoon visiting Hortense when they were at church the previous day, and Gail was excited to learn what she could from the older woman. "Hortense, I brought you an eager pupil," Brenda announced as the door swung open, revealing the famed midwife whose reputation for plant wisdom was known throughout the area. "Ah, welcome, my dears," Hortense exclaimed, her eyes twinkling with a knowledge earned through decades of tending to both the land and its people. "I hear you've got a mind to learn about the healing arts, Miss Gail?" Gail nodded, her enthusiasm barely contained. "Yes, ma'am. I reckon there's much your herbs can teach me." "Then step right in," Hortense beckoned, leading them into the heart of her sanctuary. The interior of the cottage was nature's pharmacy. Bunches of dried herbs hung like chandeliers from aged beams, their shadows dancing upon walls lined with shelves of glass jars. Each container bore a handwritten label, a catalogue of remedies waiting to be explored. Brenda, ever the observer, perched herself on a wooden stool and watched with quiet interest as Gail ventured closer to Hortense's world of green wonders. "Every plant here has a purpose," Hortense began, her voice steady and sure as she plucked a sprig of something green and delicate from a nearby jar. "This here's yerba buena. Good for settling stomachs and calming nerves." "Yerba buena," Gail repeated, rolling the name off her tongue as though it were a sacred incantation, her fingers tracing the tiny leaves with reverence. She looked at Brenda, who was jotting down the name of the herb. Hortense confirmed with a nod. "And over here we have feverfew, a steadfast ally against headaches and fevers, as the name might suggest." "Seems like every ailment has its counterpart in nature," Gail mused aloud, her mind filled with possibilities. "Nature provides, child," Hortense replied sagely. "But it takes a discerning eye and a caring hand to harness its gifts." Gail's imagination took root among the herbs and potions of Hortense's cozy abode. She could already envision the medicinal garden beside the hotel, a place where guests could find respite, but each plant would have a purpose. Hortense lifted a jar from the shelf, the contents inside a maze of roots and earthy fragments. "This one's echinacea," she informed Gail, her fingers deftly unscrewing the lid to allow the scent to escape. "A force against colds, it stirs up the immune system like a robust wind at the back of a sail." "Could it truly fend off illness?" Gail inquired, her eyes wide with wonder as she leaned in to catch the subtle aroma. "Oh, yes," Hortense affirmed, eyes twinkling. "Many a sniffle has met its match with this hardy plant." Gail absorbed every word, her mind racing with thoughts. The idea of growing such powerful plants herself sparked a flame within her. "Have you knowledge of plants for pain? For surely travelers weary from long journeys would be grateful for such relief," she asked, her voice laced with an eagerness to learn. "Ah, for that we turn to willow bark," said Hortense, moving to another jar filled with curled shavings that resembled miniature scrolls. "It eases pains and aches, much like the modern potion of aspirin." "Remarkable," breathed Gail, her fingertips grazing the bark, imagining the comfort it could bring. They continued on, Hortense introducing Gail to a plethora of herbs, lavender for sleep, peppermint for vigor, chamomile for serenity, each with a role to play in the art of healing. They were there for hours before Brenda rose from her stool, signaling it was time to depart. Gail felt as though she was leaving behind a treasure trove. They stepped outside into the balmy Texas evening, the air still heavy with the day's heat as they made their way back toward Brenda's house. "Can you imagine it, Brenda?" Gail spoke, her words tumbling out. "A garden brimming with these wonders right beside the hotel. Guests could take a piece of health back with them, alongside memories of their stay." Brenda hummed in agreement, her mind occupied with visions of children running through rows of herbs, learning nature's secrets as Gail had today. Such a garden could be more than just a novelty, it could be a sanctuary, Gail continued, her strides growing brisker with each new idea. "People would love to walk among a garden like that, even if they didn't know they were healing herbs," Brenda agreed, smiling at Gail's infectious enthusiasm. "And with your knack for growth and mending, who better to tend to it?" The two women shared a glance, understanding passing between them without need for further words. The medicinal garden was no longer a mere fancy. It was a calling that Gail was ready to answer. Later, Gail stood at the edge of the vacant lot beside the hotel. It was a patch of land that most considered untamed, a place where only the hardiest of wildflowers dared to bloom. But to Gail, it was an untouched canvas, a space ripe for transformation. She would build a gazebo and benches, so guests could sit in the middle of the medicinal garden. Every plant would have a purpose. Imagine, she murmured to herself. Lavender here, echinacea there, and maybe a willow tree in the corner for its bark. Her hands itched to till the soil, to bring life from the earth that would, in turn, breathe new vitality into the guests who sought refuge in their establishment. She envisioned signposts detailing each plant's uses, winding paths where visitors could stroll and learn, and benches where they could sit and soak in the fragrant air. The garden would not only be a haven for the weary, but also a testament to the healing embrace of nature. Max needs to see this, she decided, determination setting her jaw firm. With fleet steps that carried her excitement, Gail made her way back to the hotel, seeking out the man whose opinion mattered most in turning her vision into reality. Max was in his office when Gail found him, ledger forgotten on the table as he rubbed tired eyes. He glanced up, a warm smile appearing as he took in her animated approach. "Max, I've got an idea," Gail started, her words spilling out before she even reached his table. "The empty lot." "Slow down, Gail," Max chuckled, pushing his chair back and gesturing for her to sit. "You're talking faster than I can listen. Now, what's this grand idea?" Gail took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts like cards to lay neatly before him. "A medicinal garden," she said, her voice a blend of passion and clarity. "Right next to the hotel. A place where our guests can find peace and healing. Hortense Blakely showed me all sorts of plants today, and I think we could create something special." Max leaned forward, elbows on the table, intrigue lighting up his features. "A medicinal garden?" he echoed thoughtfully. "That's quite the undertaking, Gail, but you've got that look in your eye, the one that says you've already built it in your mind." "More than just built it," Gail replied, leaning in as well. "I can see it, Max. I can see our guests walking through it, learning about the plants, feeling better just by being there. And I thought, maybe you'd want to help make it real." "Help? I'd be honored to," Max said earnestly. His gaze held hers, and in that moment, she knew she had more than his attention, she had his belief in her. "Let's do it, Gail. Let's bring your garden to life." "Truly?" Gail's heart swelled, a surge of elation sweeping through her. To have Max's support meant the world, it was the wind beneath the wings of her dream. "Truly," Max confirmed with a nod. "We'll need to plan, of course. Figure out what plants will grow, how we'll arrange them. But I'm with you every step of the way. Now that Samantha is managing the restaurant, you'll have more free time to do what you want to do. Perhaps you could work at the hotel in the afternoons, and work on your garden in the mornings?" "Oh, that would be perfect, thank you, Max," Gail breathed, a broad smile stretching across her face. "You won't regret this. This garden. It'll be something Fort Worth has never seen before." Gail stood in the empty lot the following morning with Max by her side, her eyes tracing the outlines of an invisible blueprint that only she could see. "Think about it, Max," she said, her hands moving animatedly as though sketching her thoughts into the air. "We can start with rows of chamomile and echinacea right along here." She pointed to the edge of the lot closest to the hotel. Max nodded, following her gaze. "That would be a sight for sore eyes, and quite literally soothing for our guests." "The chamomile's calming, isn't it?" "Exactly," Gail exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. "And the echinacea could help ward off those pesky colds travelers always seem to come down with." "Smart thinking," Max conceded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What about the space in the center?" he asked, gesturing toward the heart of the lot. "Ah," Gail said, tapping a finger against her lips thoughtfully, "I'll build a gazebo there, and we'll plant the lavender all around it. Can you imagine the fragrance wafting through the windows on a breezy day?" "Sounds wonderful," Max replied, picturing guests leaning out their windows to breathe in the fragrant air. "We could even have little placards explaining each herb's properties." "Placards? I like that," Gail agreed, her eyes shining with excitement. "It's not just a garden, it's an experience, an educational stroll. Oh, and I want to add a bench or two, or 6, for those who wish to sit and bask in the serenity. Of course, a place to rest and reflect," Max said, warming to the vision that was unfolding between them. "And what about the far end? It looks lonely." Lonely now, but not for long, Gail answered. There we could grow peppermint, lemon balm, maybe some ginger. The robust ones that can take the Texas heat. Ah, a corner of invigoration, Max mused. This is going to be more than a garden, Gail, it's going to be a sanctuary. Exactly. A sanctuary, Gail said. She looked at Max, her expression earnest. So, are we doing this? Without a shadow of a doubt, Max said, his voice firm. We're going to make this happen, Gail. This garden will show the world what we can achieve as partners. Partners, she repeated, letting the word roll off her tongue. I like the sound of that. She extended her hand, and he shook it firmly, a gesture that sealed their joint endeavor. Then it's settled, Gail said, her gaze sweeping across the lot once more. We'll create a haven of healing right here in Fort Worth. Let's get to it, Max replied, rolling up his sleeves. There's no time like the present to start sowing the seeds of our future. Gail squinted against the bright sun, her hand shielding her eyes as she and Max stepped onto the grounds of a sprawling nursery. The air was thick with the scent of greenery, and despite the sweltering heat, there was an energy that surrounded them. Would you look at this place? Gail exclaimed, her voice bubbling with excitement. It's like stepping into an Eden of possibilities. Max nodded, his eyes scanning the rows upon rows of plants. I've heard Mr. Greenwald's nursery holds the finest selection around Fort Worth. We're bound to find everything we need here. They meandered along the gravel paths, their steps in sync as they reached out to brush their fingers over silvery lamb's ear leaves and inhale the sweet fragrance of blooming lavender. At each turn, there was another herb waiting to be discovered, another plant begging to be part of their medicinal oasis. Chamomile, Gail murmured, gently cradling the dainty white flowers. Just imagine, guests sipping tea brewed from our very own garden. Calming and soothing, Max agreed. A perfect addition. He jotted down a note in the small ledger he'd brought along. And what about echinacea? We definitely need echinacea, Gail said, grinning at him. Their collaboration felt as natural as the soil beneath their feet. After hours spent among the botanical treasures, their list had grown long and their vision clearer. They left the nursery with sketches and notes, eager to transform the empty lot beside the hotel into a sanctuary of healing. The following day, Gail and Max donned wide-brimmed hats and sturdy boots, ready for the task ahead. They were joined by an enthusiastic crew from the hotel staff, along with a pair of local landscapers who came highly recommended. All right, folks, Gail announced, rolling up the sleeves of her blouse. We've got ourselves a patch of earth to tame. Let's show it some love and make it bloom. Under the relentless sun, they worked side by side, clearing away debris and turning the stubborn dirt. Laughter and chatter filled the air, mixing with the sounds of shovels and rakes. It was backbreaking work, but with each cleared space and each row tilled, their shared dream took one more step toward reality. Look at this teamwork, Gail said, pausing to wipe her brow. It's like watching a barn raising without the barn. It is, Max replied, chuckling as he hoisted a wheelbarrow filled with soil. It seems we're quite adept at inspiring a collective spirit. Who knew a hotelier and an orphan could become such forces of nature? Gail mused, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Ah, but Gail, therein lies the romance of life, Max said. Defying expectations and nurturing growth, both in gardens and in ourselves. Gail knelt beside a row of small holes, her hands deftly placing chamomile seeds into the earth with practiced precision. Beside her, Max did the same, his movements mirroring hers as they worked in comfortable silence. Imagine, Gail said, breaking the quiet as she patted down the soil around a newly planted echinacea, guests sipping tea brewed from herbs they'd watched grow right outside their windows. More than just a cup of tea, Max added, planting a lemon balm seedling and looking up with bright eyes. It's a whole experience. A story you can taste and feel. Exactly. Gail beamed at him, her enthusiasm infectious. We're not just hoteliers. We're storytellers, healers even. Max laughed lightly, the sound mingling with the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I never pictured myself as a healer when I took on the family business. But with you here, it seems anything is possible. Their hands moved together, rhythmically planting, watering, and nurturing each new addition to their shared project. Max was only able to join her after he'd finished his work for the day, but it was good to have him there, helping her. Gail and Max stood shoulder to shoulder, surveying the rows of tiny green shoots that dotted the plot. It was a humble beginning, but within each fragile stem lay the potential for growth, healing, and beauty. "We've done well today, haven't we?" Gail asked, her voice tinged with pride as she wiped a streak of dirt from her cheek. "More than well," Max responded, his gaze not leaving the garden. "We've started something special here, Gail. Something that'll thrive." A sense of accomplishment swelled between them, a shared sentiment that went beyond the physical work they'd completed. "Tomorrow we'll see the first sprouts," Gail mused, her eyes reflecting the sunset's fading light. "And the day after that, perhaps the first blooms," Max replied, his hand finding hers amidst the greenery. As the first stars began to twinkle in the deepening twilight, Gail and Max made their way from the fledgling medicinal garden toward the warm glow of the hotel's back entrance. The air was still heavy with the scent of freshly turned earth, a fragrant reminder of the day's work. "Miss Gail, Mr. Max," a voice called out from the shadowed veranda, where a figure leaned against the railing, a pipe clutched in one hand. It was Hank, the night clerk, his usually impassive face lit up by a grin as broad as the horizon. "Word's already spreading about your garden project. Guests are asking about it left and right." "Really?" Gail replied, a flush of excitement coloring her cheeks. She exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Max, a spark of shared anticipation igniting between them. "Yes sir," Hank continued, puffing on his pipe. "Mrs. Mabel from room 106, she's got this rheumatism that's been pesterin' her something fierce. Says she heard tell of healing herbs and such. Reckons she'll be first in line once y'all get to harvestin'. Max chuckled, his eyes gleaming with equal parts amusement and pride. "Well, we're not quite at the harvesting stage yet, Hank. But it's heartening to know there's interest." "Interest?" "More like a downright curiosity," Hank corrected him, tapping the ash from his pipe. "Folks are sayin' it's like havin' Doc Stanton's remedies growin' right here on the premises." Gail's spirits soared at the comparison. To think their humble garden could evoke the same trust and respect as the town's beloved physician stirred something deep within her, a fervent desire to prove that they could indeed make a difference. "Thank you, Hank," she said, her voice steady, despite the fluttering in her chest. "We'll be sure to keep everyone updated on the garden's progress." "Sure thing, Miss Gail." Hank tipped his hat as he retreated inside. With the night now fully upon them, Gail and Max paused at the threshold, the soft yellow light from inside the hotel spilling onto the porch. Max turned to Gail, his expression tender. The work they were doing was going to help others. They both knew it. Chapter 8. The sun outside was relentless. Inside the cool confines of the hotel office, Gail shuffled through the stack of invoices and reservation slips with practiced hands. She glanced up at Max Carlson, who sat hunched over a ledger, his brow knitted in concentration as he reviewed the financial reports. Gail watched him for a moment longer, noting the way the worry lines deepened upon his forehead. She set down the papers, perching herself on the edge of the desk. "We could try something new to bring in more guests. Maybe host some special events, or offer discounts during the off-season?" Max's pen paused mid-stroke. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, but there was a distance in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "I don't know, Gail. We're barely keeping our heads above water as it is. Everything was going well until the past few weeks. I'm praying this turns around." Surely a little creativity wouldn't hurt, she pressed on, undeterred by his hesitance. "We have to do something different, shake things up a bit." He let out a heavy sigh, placing the pen down with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, I really do. But these figures." His hand gestured vaguely towards the ledger, "they don't leave much room for risk." "Max, we can't just bury our heads in the sand," Gail insisted, her voice firm but gentle. "Sometimes, to save something you love, you have to be willing to defy the odds." Max didn't respond. He simply turned back to his reports, his shoulders hunching as if to ward off her words. Gail watched him for a long beat, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, the hum of the ceiling fan the only sound in the room. With a soft sigh, Gail slid off the desk. She gathered the papers she had been organizing, her movements deliberate. If Max was determined to shoulder the burden alone, she would find another way to help. "All right then," she said, more to herself than to him, as she moved towards the door. "Let's keep at it." She left the office, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Max to his solitude and his ledgers. And though the Texas heat lay oppressive and unyielding outside, Gail felt a defiant spark ignite within her. They would weather this storm together, whether Max realized it yet or not. Gail made her way through the cluster of businesses neighboring the hotel. The relentless sun bore down unforgivingly, but it did little to wilt her resolve. She entered each establishment with the grace of a diplomat, her proposal clasped in her hands. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jenkins," Gail greeted the proprietor of the local general store, her tone as warm as the breeze that trickled in through the open door. "I've come by with an idea that might benefit us both." She laid out her plan with practiced ease, explaining how a partnership could drive more patrons to their respective doors. She would design a book, a compendium of local enterprise, and in exchange, the hotel would proudly display flyers promoting each business alongside its heralded medicinal garden. "Your hardware supplies next to our healing herbs," she said with a smile. By the time she left the last shop, her arms were laden with agreements and a sense of accomplishment that buoyed her spirits. It was a small victory, but there was hope, and hope was what they needed most. Returning to the sanctuary of the hotel's medicinal garden, Gail traded paper for pruning shears. Here, among the fragrant basil and the whispering leaves of the eucalyptus, she found solace. Her fingers worked deftly, trimming and nurturing, her mind a whirlwind of botanical knowledge and tender care. Each plant held a promise, a balm for body and soul, and Gail tended to them with the same fervor she dedicated to every task. She paused, wiping a bead of perspiration from her brow, and surveyed the fruits of her labor. A gentle sigh escaped her lips as she knelt beside a particularly vibrant echinacea, its purple petals reaching skyward. In that moment, Gail understood that her love for Max and this place they were striving to protect was akin to these plants, deep-rooted and ever-growing. "Max needs to see this," she murmured to herself, and with the setting sun casting long shadows across the garden, Gail resolved to bridge the distance his worries had created, armed with the determination that had carried her this far. Gail approached Max, who was standing over a flurry of papers that covered the once orderly desk in the hotel's office. She held a hand-drawn map of the garden, eager to discuss her latest ideas for enhancing its appeal to their guests. "Max," she began, her eyes reflecting the day's fading light, "I've been thinking about how we can integrate the garden more with our guest experience." But before she could unfold the parchment cradling her visions, Max's voice cut through the serene twilight like a scythe through overripe wheat. "Not now, Gail," he snapped, his eyes barely lifting from the sea of financial reports. "Can't you see I'm drowning in this mess?" Stunned by the sharpness in his tone, she retreated, leaving the map untouched between them. Outside, Gail's paced breaths mingled with the scents of thyme and rosemary. The medicinal garden embraced her with its natural tranquility, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside. She brushed her fingers across the leaves of a lemon balm, its calming fragrance grounding her fluttering spirit. Here, in her leafy sanctuary, Gail allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, letting the hurt wash over her like a summer rainstorm, swift and cleansing. Once her composure had returned, fortified by the stoic silhouettes of her beloved plants, Gail knew what she must do. She needed counsel, not from the ancient whisperings of sage or the silent wisdom of lavender, but from flesh and blood who understood the intricate dance of marriage. The next morning found Gail at Hannah's doorstep, the air still cool from the night's reprieve. Hannah was the sister closest to her in age, and they'd always been close to one another. Hannah welcomed her with a knowing look, one that spoke volumes of shared confidences and sisterly intuition. As they sat on the porch, the wooden swing gently creaking with their weight, Gail poured out her heart, voicing her fears and frustrations. Hannah listened, her hands still as the lace she so often spun lay forgotten in her lap. "Marriage is much like your garden," Hannah finally said, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. It requires patience, dedication, and most importantly, communication. It's not just about weathering storms together. It's also about enjoying the sunshine while it lasts. Gail nodded, absorbing the truth in Hannah's words. Compromise wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a testament to the strength of their union. They needed to tend to their relationship with the same care Gail afforded her cherished herbs. "Thank you, Hannah," Gail said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "I suppose it's time Max and I had a proper talk, away from ledgers and bookings." Hannah smiled, a soft upturn of lips that bore the gentle assurance of spring following winter. "Just remember, Gail, love is the rarest bloom of all. Nurture it, and it will flourish." Gail pushed open the kitchen door with a determined set to her jaw, the clatter and sizzle of the busy restaurant kitchen forming a chaotic backdrop to her mission. There was Max, a veritable storm of activity amidst the stainless steel counters, his arm movements deft as he juggled the roles of hotel and restaurant manager in Samantha's absence. She watched him for a moment, his brow furrowed under the strain. "Max," she called, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the din of pots and pans. He turned, momentarily startled, then offered a weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Gail, he began, but was cut off by the urgent shout of a sous chef. Later, Max mouthed, before turning back to the chaos, but Gail stood firm, understanding that if not now, the chasm between them might only widen. "Max, we need to talk," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for postponement. He hesitated, then nodded, signaling to the sous chef that he would be back in a moment. They moved to the relative quiet of the pantry, surrounded by shelves laden with spices and canned goods. "Max, I can see you're overwhelmed," Gail started, locking eyes with him. "And I know I've been preoccupied with the garden. But this, us working past each other, it isn't working." Max leaned against a shelf, the weight of the world seemingly on his shoulders. "I know," he admitted, his voice raspy. "I'm sorry, Gail. It's just that everything is piling up, and with Samantha sick." "Then let's divide and conquer," she suggested. "We're a team, remember? Your burdens are mine, too. Sometimes I fear that if I lean on you too much, I'll only drag you down with me," Max confessed, his warm eyes clouded with worry. "Max Carlson, don't you dare think so lowly of either of us," Gail chided, a half-smile playing on her lips despite the gravity of their conversation. "We married to share life's load. I won't have you shouldering it alone." Max reached out, his hand gently enveloping hers. "I forget sometimes," he said quietly. "In trying to protect what my parents built, I forget that you're not just my wife. You're my partner, in every sense of the word. And I've been afraid, Gail. Afraid of failing them, the business." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Gail replied, squeezing his hand. "It's facing it head-on, together. We both have dreams for this place, and they don't exclude each other. Your parents are proud of how you've kept their legacy alive. Now, let's make it our own legacy, too." Max's eyes softened, the tension easing from his shoulders. "We will," he agreed, his voice strengthening. "And you're right. I've been so focused on keeping afloat, I've neglected the fact that we each have passions that can actually help the business grow. Your medicinal garden, it's not just a hobby, it's an asset." Gail nodded, feeling heard and valued. "Exactly. It can be part of what makes us special, what draws guests in. We need to find harmony between my love for nature and your knack for hospitality." "Harmony," Max repeated, a spark igniting in his gaze. "You do have a way with words. Let's do this, Gail. Let's turn this place into our dreams." "Step by step," she said, her voice firm yet filled with affection. "Starting with making sure you eat something. You can't run a restaurant on an empty stomach." Max chuckled, a genuine smile breaking through. "I suppose the hotel owner fainting from hunger wouldn't be good for business." "Decidedly not," Gail said, pulling him gently towards the dining area. "And even worse if the restaurant owner fainted from hunger." Gail watched as Max, his brows furrowed in concentration, pored over the endless columns of figures that filled the pages of the ledger. The sweltering heat of the Texas summer seemed to have seeped into the hotel's office, wrapping around them with a suffocating embrace. Yet, Max seemed impervious to it, because he was engrossed in the task at hand. "Max," Gail said, "I know Samantha's absence has left us short-handed. I can take on more around here until she returns." Max looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of surprise and relief. It was as if he'd been drowning and she had thrown him a lifeline. "Gail, that would be. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." His words tumbled out, a genuine gratitude washing over his features. "And I." He hesitated, the shadow of remorse passing through his eyes. "I'm sorry for the moodiness. It's just that." "Say no more," Gail interjected, a reassuring smile gracing her lips. "We're in this together, remember?" He nodded, the tension easing from his shoulders. A week passed with the swiftness of a prairie wind, and Samantha finally returned, healthy. With the restaurant back in capable hands, Gail seized the moment to turn her attention to the garden. She rolled up her sleeves, her athletic frame bending and moving with practiced ease as she worked on constructing the benches and gazebo that would soon grace their medicinal haven. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Gail's spirit did not waver. She measured, sawed, and hammered. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her passion into something tangible, a gift not only to herself but to the hotel and its future guests. From time to time, she glanced up to see Max through the windows, still buried in his work. His dedication was unwavering, but she knew the toll it took on him. Even now, as she constructed these symbols of rest and contemplation, he toiled away, ensuring their dream stayed afloat. Gail stepped back to admire her handiwork. The benches stood sturdy and inviting, while the gazebo offered a promise of serenity in the center of the burgeoning garden. They were more than just structures. They were embodiments of her love for this place and the man who shared her dreams, even if he couldn't be by her side to help build them. Defiance might be too strong a word for such a labor, yet there was a certain defiance in the act of creating beauty when times were hard. In shaping wood and earth, Gail defied the notion that financial strain should overshadow their aspirations. Their commitment to each other and their enterprise would not be dictated by societal norms or expectations. And as the evening stars began to twinkle overhead, Gail knew that, together, they would forge a path as unique and resilient as the garden she tended with such care. Gail wiped the sweat from her brow, pushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she stepped into the shade of the gazebo. She turned just in time to see Max trudging wearily towards her, his face etched with the day's toils. "Come, sit with me," she beckoned, patting the bench beside her. Her eyes danced with excitement as she watched him approach. Max obliged, his body grateful for the respite. As he settled next to her, he couldn't help but let out an impressed whistle. "You've outdone yourself, Gail." She beamed at the compliment, then rose to her feet with sprightly energy. "Wait until you see everything." With that, she guided him on a stroll, pointing out each herb and the hand-painted signs she had made to identify them. Lavender, for calmness, chamomile, to soothe the soul, and here, she gestured to a bush with tiny white flowers, is yarrow, good for healing wounds. Max listened intently, nodding as she spoke. Each explanation was delivered with knowledge she'd garnered from Hortense and from some books she'd read. They walked back toward the hotel, the chatter of town life growing louder as they neared. Upon entering the lobby, they were greeted by the sight of a neatly bound book resting on the front desk. Gail picked it up with eager hands, presenting it to Max. "Local businesses and I worked together on this," she said, pride lacing her words. "Each page features one of them, and they'll all display flyers for our hotel and its medicinal garden." Max leafed through the pages, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "Your ingenuity never ceases to amaze me," he admitted, his earlier frustrations melting away in the warmth of her triumph. Max set the plates down on the small table by the window, the aroma of roasted chicken mingling with the fresh scent of herbs that clung to Gail's skin. Despite the modest size of their hotel room, there was an air of coziness to it that made the space theirs and theirs alone. Gail watched him through lashes heavy with contentment, noting the lines of strain around his eyes had eased. The weight of the world seemed lifted, if only for the evening, and she felt a surge of affection for the man who had become both partner and confidant. Here's to us, Max raised his glass, the soft clink echoing their sentiment, and to the many seasons we'll weather together, as unpredictable as they may be. Here's to us, Gail echoed, her voice steady and sure. As they ate, laughter and tales of the day weaving between them, she knew that she had found the man she was meant to spend her life with. And she was so happy, he'd chosen her for his own. Chapter 9. The great storm outside rattled the windows of the hotel with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the establishment. Thunder boomed while the wind howled like a pack of wolves on the prowl. Inside, Gail and Max Carlson sought refuge from nature's untamed symphony, their figures illuminated by flashes of lightning that tore through the darkened skies. "Mercy," Gail muttered, her gaze fixed upon the window as another crash of thunder shook the panes. "Sounds like the heavens themselves are having a fight." Max, standing a pace behind her, couldn't help a wry smile at her expression. "If so, I reckon they've chosen right above us for their battlefield." His tone was light, but his eyes held a concern that mirrored her own. Gail pressed her face closer to the glass, squinting through the relentless downpour that turned the world into a blur of gray and green. Her heart sank as she caught sight of the hail pelting down upon the garden that sprawled before the hotel. "Those aren't just raindrops," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. "They're more like stones cast from the sky." "Let's hope the greenery is resilient," Max replied, joining her at the window. Through the deluge, he could see the outlines of once proud rose bushes and hardy marigolds, now under siege. "Resilient, yes, but not invincible," Gail said, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I can practically hear the snap of stems and the crack of branches from here." She turned from the window, the set of her jaw telling of her resolve. "As soon as this lets up, there'll be work to do. And plenty of it." She stared for a moment. "Maybe I should go and cover the plants somehow." "You're not going out in that," Max protested. "That hail could hurt you." "I've never seen hailstones that big." "But..." "No. I'm not risking my wife for some plants." "Thank you, Max," Gail said, a fleeting smile touching her lips, despite the calamity. She glanced back out the window, her eyes reflecting the flash of distant lightning, and in them blazed a spirit that no tempest could dampen. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush that seemed to resonate with the heaviness of its departure. Gail glanced at Max, the silent agreement between them needing no words as they stepped over the threshold and into the aftermath. The hotel door closed with a gentle click, a piteous contrast to the wrath that had battered it only moments before. Outside, the world was transformed. Where there had been vibrant beds of blossoms, there now lay a battlefield of greenery. Broken branches littered the pathways, and uprooted plants lay strewn about. Mud slurped greedily at their boots as they walked, each step an intrusion upon the scene of devastation. Gail's throat tightened, her eyes widening as she took in the full extent of the devastation. Her beloved gardens, once a kaleidoscope of color and life, were now a palette of browns and grays, broken and beaten by nature's indifferent hand. She felt a pang deep within her chest, as if the shattered stems and trampled petals mirrored the fragments of her heart scattered among the debris. "Good heavens," she whispered, the words catching on a breath that held both awe and sorrow. Max remained close, his presence a steady warmth beside her in the chill that followed the storm. He watched her face, the lines of distress etched there more telling than any words could be. They stood side by side, kindred spirits, bound by the shared loss laid out before them. "Look at this," Gail murmured, bending to lift a muddied rose. Its petals hung limp, the vibrant reds washed away to leave anemic streaks upon its skin. "So much care. All for nothing." Her voice broke. Max reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the damaged flower from her grasp. "Perhaps not," he said softly. "They were beautiful, because you made them so. And you can again." Her gaze met his, seeking the conviction in his eyes. There it was, a flicker of hope, a challenge flung in the face of ruin. It was the ember she needed. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, the spirit within her rekindling. "Then we will start over," Gail said. "Nature may have its tantrums, but it hasn't met a force quite like me." Max chuckled. "No, it hasn't. Together, they turned to survey the garden once more, not as a testament to destruction, but as a canvas awaiting rebirth. The sun peeked through the parting clouds, its rays tentative but warming, as if an encouragement of the resolve that had taken root amidst the chaos. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of restoration, of life coaxed back from the brink by hands willing to toil and hearts too stubborn to yield. Gail inhaled deeply, the post-storm air fresh and tinged with a scent of damp earth. With a resolute squaring of her shoulders, she rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, a no-nonsense gesture that signaled the commencement of a battle against nature's recent onslaught. There was no room for hesitation. The gardens needed her, and she would make them whole again. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Green, if you please," she called out to the hotel staff who had ventured outside, their faces as grim as the skies had been an hour past. "We've much to do, and daylight won't last much longer." The gardener, a burly man with hands as gnarled as the branches they now sought to clear, nodded with a grunt. One of the maids, a round-cheeked woman, got to her knees and replanted an herb that had been uprooted. "Where shall we start, Miss Gail?" asked Mr. Thompson, his gaze sweeping the ravaged landscape. "Begin by salvaging the roses," Gail instructed, pointing to the battered bushes that still held on to life by mere threads. "They're hardier than they look. And Mrs. Stevens, those lilies over there might yet be saved if we're careful." Max, who had quietly observed Gail's swift transition into command, now stepped forward, his hands ready to serve. "I'll tackle the larger debris," he offered, his eyes locking onto a particularly formidable branch that barred their path. "Thank you, Max," Gail replied, her voice carrying both gratitude and the urgency of their collective mission. Together, the impromptu team moved through the garden with methodical purpose. They lifted branches and gathered scattered foliage, gently extracting plants from the mire and setting aside those that could be nursed back to health. This late in the season, it could all be for naught, but Gail would do her best. She had to. "Careful with that vine, Mr. Thompson," Gail cautioned as the gardener hoisted a mass of greenery. "It's more delicate than it appears." "Of course, Miss Gail," he responded, adjusting his grip. As the hours waned and their pile of salvageable plants grew, Gail found herself thankful for the camaraderie that hardship often bred. It was a dance of restoration, led by a young woman whose spirit refused to acquiesce to the wild whims of summer storms. "Looks like this garden has quite the caretaker," Max remarked as he joined Gail in straightening a young sapling, its trunk bent but unbroken. Gail glanced at him, her hand steady as she fashioned a brace from a nearby stick. "This garden has a family," she corrected with a soft smile. "And we look after our own." Gail paused before an ancient oak, now uprooted and sprawled across the path, its broad limbs crushing the delicate wooden bench beneath. "Drat," she muttered under her breath, the word cutting sharply through the hush of their aftermath labors. Max, who'd been hauling a wheelbarrow filled with broken twigs, looked toward her, noting the furrow between her brows. "Something I can help with," he called out, his voice carrying over the sound of dripping leaves. "It's this blasted tree," Gail said, motioning to the fallen giant. "And my favorite bench, too." She kicked at the trunk. "Seems like Mother Nature's got a sense of humor," Max replied, setting aside the wheelbarrow and joining her. "Quite," Gail agreed dryly. "Only, I'm not laughing." They stood side by side, contemplating the ruin. It was a momentary defeat, a stark reminder that for all her tenacity, she was at the mercy of the elements. But then, as if flicked by some internal switch, Gail shook off the despondency. Her hands reached out, tracing the lines of the bark as if seeking wisdom from the tree itself. "Perhaps," she murmured, her mind ticking over like clockwork. "Max, do you think we could use part of this tree?" "Use it?" Max asked, perplexed. "How so?" "Supports," Gail explained. "We can't save the bench, but we can salvage these branches. Cut them down to size, strip the leaves, and they'll make fine stakes to prop up those roses over there." She gestured to the row of battered flowers. "Resourceful," Max noted with a hint of admiration, watching as Gail began directing two of the guests who had volunteered to assist. "I'll fetch the saw." "Hurry," Gail instructed. "We've no time to waste." With swift efficiency, they set to work. Max sawed through branches with measured strokes, while Gail and the others gathered the sturdiest of the lot. They fashioned makeshift supports, tying the stems of the storm-tossed plants to their new anchors, with strips torn from an old bed sheet. Like phoenixes from the ashes, one of the guests remarked, a smile playing on his lips as he helped secure a particularly stubborn rosebush. Exactly so, Gail agreed without missing a beat, her tone firm with conviction. These gardens will rise again, mark my words. As the sun began to pierce the gray remnants of the storm clouds, casting golden light upon their handiwork, there was a sense of order restored, piece by piece, branch by branch. Gail stood back, hands on hips, surveying the scene. Gail knelt in the mud, her skirts bundled up haphazardly, to keep the hem from dragging. The storm had been merciless, ripping out plants by their roots and leaving the once vibrant gardens a wasteland of torn greenery and broken blossoms. Every end is but a chance for a new beginning, she murmured, placing a tender shoot into a freshly dug hole. Despite the destruction around her, Gail's determination was as sturdy as the oak trees that bordered the garden, trees that now stood as silent sentinels over the chaos. Her brow furrowed, a testament to the weight of the task at hand. With each plant she resettled into the ground, Gail's resolve hardened. Confound it, she exclaimed as a particularly stubborn root refused to settle in its new home. For a fleeting moment, despair threatened to overtake her. What if the gardens never recovered? What if all her efforts were for naught? But then, she noticed a tiny sprout unfurling its leaves amidst a pile of debris. A small sigh escaped her lips, not of resignation, but of wonder. Life was tenacious. It clung on, even when all odds were stacked against it. Take heart, little one, Gail whispered to the plant, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. You and I, we're cut from the same cloth. With renewed vigor, she rose to her feet, stepping gingerly between the rows of devastation and rebirth. As she worked, her movements became less mechanical, more rhythmic, a dance of creation as old as time. Each cleared path, each salvaged plant was a victory, a tiny rebellion against the storm's attempt to erase what she held dear. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow that seemed to breathe life into the battered garden. Gail wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. This was more than mere plants, and she was going to keep as many alive as she possibly could. From scratch, then, she said, planting another seedling. We shall begin anew and flourish. Max observed Gail from a distance, the set of her shoulders speaking volumes of her character. As she hefted a heavy branch, clearly too cumbersome for one person to manage alone, he stepped forward. Let me help with that, he offered. Much obliged, Max, Gail replied without looking up, her concentration fixed on the task at hand. Together, they maneuvered the fallen limb off the crushed remnants of a flower bed, revealing the havoc wreaked by nature's fury. Seems like the storm's got a mean streak, Max commented lightly, attempting to infuse a touch of levity. Storms don't play favorites, Gail said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, her eyes betraying a flicker of amusement. But I think we can salvage most of this mess. He couldn't help but chuckle. I'd bet my last dollar on that. Side by side, they set about clearing away debris. Your faith in me is heartening, she said after a stretch of silence, her tone sincere. Especially when the sky itself seems to have turned against us. Ah, but the sky also brings rain to nourish, Max replied, glancing up at the now clear blue expanse above them. Just as it requires effort to rebuild, it takes strength to remain hopeful. Hope's a hardy plant, isn't it? Gail mused, stopping to examine a cluster of green poking defiantly through the soil, a small but irrefutable sign of life. Yes, it is, Max affirmed, standing beside her and marveling at the tiny leaf's determination. It's about putting down roots deep enough to withstand the storms. Speaking of roots, Gail said, a smile creeping onto her lips, despite the destruction around them. She bent down and gently cleared the mud from around the resilient sprouts. Would you look at that? These are the bellflowers I planted 2 months ago. Stubborn little things. Seems they take after their gardener, Max teased, crouching next to her to get a better look. Perhaps, Gail conceded with a soft laugh. Or maybe they're just fortunate enough to find themselves under your care as well. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual respect that had taken root. Then let's give them, and the rest of the garden, the fighting chance they deserve, Max said, extending his hand to help her up. Agreed, Gail replied, accepting his assistance and rising to her feet. Together, we'll see this garden thrive again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cleared earth, the air was filled not with the sound of destruction, but with the promise of renewal. Chapter 10. Gail moved among the roses with a practiced eye, carefully selecting each stem before making precise cuts. Her fingers deftly maneuvered the pruning shears, snipping away at the excess, with an almost maternal attentiveness. "Careful there, Gail," Max said playfully as he dragged a huge bucket of water along the rows of thirsty flower beds. "You're treating those roses like they're fragile debutantes at their first ball." Gail straightened up, casting him a mock stern look. "And you're watering those petunias as if trying to drown them," she retorted, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "There's finesse in gardening, Max. Not just brute force." "Ah, but see, they thrive under my care," Max boasted with a grin. "They recognize the hand of a master." "Master, is it?" Gail chuckled, stepping closer to help guide the spray, their hands briefly touching as they adjusted the nozzle. "I suppose next, you'll be telling me you can make the sunflowers turn by sheer willpower?" "Given time, I might just surprise you," Max replied, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Their banter continued, echoing through the garden as the two worked in comfortable companionship. There was a rhythm to their movements, a dance of sorts, that had developed over time. Gail moved with an energy that seemed to infuse life into the plants around her, while Max's steady hand and measured steps brought balance and order to the chaos of nature. "Admit it, you enjoy this as much as I do," Gail said, flashing Max a knowing smile as she began to prune another rosebush, her movements deliberate yet graceful. "Only because it's with you," he conceded, watching her work with a fondness that he couldn't quite hide. "You bring a certain panache to the mundane." "Panache? Now there's a word that isn't used nearly enough," she said, glancing over her shoulder, "but I'll take it as a compliment, coming from Fort Worth's finest hotelier." "Only the truth, Gail," Max replied, setting the bucket down and joining her at the rosebush. "Your touch brings out the best in these flowers. And in me." He wiggled his eyebrows lecherously, making her giggle. "Then we make quite the team," Gail responded. Together, they tended to the garden, enjoying the simple tasks, because they were together. The sun beat down upon the oasis tucked behind the bustling hotel, where Gail stood with hands on hips, surveying an empty patch of earth. She brushed a lock of sun-bleached hair from her brow and turned to Max, her eyes filled with inspiration. "Max, just envision it, a splash of color right here. What do you think about planting some zinnias? Their bright blooms would be perfect against the green," Gail suggested, her tone brimming with excitement at the prospect of enhancing their shared labor of love. Max wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of dirt in its wake. "Zinnias, you say?" he mused, matching her enthusiasm with a nod of approval. "A good idea, Gail. Maybe in the spring. It's too late in the season to plant anything more now. Besides, zinnias are almost as beautiful as you." "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Carlson," she retorted with a playful grin. "Max, what if we added a little alcove here? A place where guests could sit and truly take in the splendor of the garden?" Her hands gestured to a spot near the fragrant rosebushes, already painting the picture in the air between them. "An alcove?" Max repeated, glancing at the indicated area. His entrepreneurial mind seized upon the suggestion with interest. "You mean a seating area?" "Exactly," she exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. "Some benches, perhaps a few chairs, arranged just so. It would be a perfect spot for our guests to relax and enjoy the beauty we tend to every day. We could even have the restaurant make up special picnics to be eaten there." "I like it," Max said. "It would add a new dimension to the experience here. And I dare say it aligns perfectly with our visions for this place." "Then we're agreed?" Gail asked, her eyes seeking confirmation. "Agreed," Max affirmed. "Let us consider the logistics." We'll need materials that can withstand the elements, of course. Something sturdy yet inviting. Leave that to me, Gail said with a confident nod. I have a knack for building things that last. Just tell me your budget, and I'll make sure every penny is put to good use. Consider it done. I trust your judgment implicitly. His voice held a note of respect, acknowledging her expertise. Besides, your work with the other businesses has truly rallied the income of the hotel. I told you we make a good team, she replied with a twinkle in her eye. The bell above the door chimed as Gail and Max entered the local furniture store, a haven of crafted wood and wrought iron. Rows of outdoor furnishings beckoned them with the promise of comfort and style. Ah, what have we here? Max mused aloud, lowering himself onto a bench with an exaggerated sigh of relief. Quite the sturdy make, wouldn't you say? Gail, who had already perched herself on a neighboring chair, rocked back slightly, testing its balance. Sturdy, yes, she responded, her eyes appraising the craftsmanship. But does it invite one to sit and stay a while? Perhaps not, he conceded, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Our guests should feel the embrace of leisure, not the call of duty. He rose and sauntered over to another option, a series of chairs with plump cushions. Now these will make our guests happy, along with their bottoms. But do we want to have cushions? A big storm could blow them away, and we'd have to chase them down. Do you really want to be seen chasing cushions down the street in your business suits? Gail asked with a playful tilt of her head, joining him. She pressed down on the cushions before sitting, a smile tugging at her lips as she sank into the softness. These may very well tempt our guests never to leave. An excellent point, Max chuckled, situating himself in the chair beside hers. They sat for a moment in comfortable silence, allowing themselves to genuinely consider the feel of each piece. It was a practical examination, but one not devoid of amusement as they observed one another's reactions. I think I can make them sturdier than these, she said softly. And more economically, he added. Good point. So they went to the lumber mill and purchased some cedar instead. It was delivered a few hours later, and Gail set to work. Would you hand me one of those screws? She asked, pointing at a pile near Max's foot. Your command is my wish, Max replied, placing the tool in her palm, their fingers brushing fleetingly in the exchange. As the last piece was tightened, they stepped back to survey their handiwork. The seating area was the perfect addition to their shared vision of how the garden should look. Exquisite, Max said, admiration evident in his gaze. Agreed, Gail said with a smile, a labor of love that speaks volumes of our combined efforts. Gail, Max said, turning to face her with earnest respect, it seems there is no end to your talents. And Max, Gail replied, meeting his gaze with a kindred spirit of pride, your dedication to this venture knows no bounds. Gail brushed a lock of hair from her forehead, leaving a smudge of earth in its wake. We ought to share this, she declared, her eyes scanning the verdant paradise they had created. Share? Max asked, wiping his hands on his trousers. A garden party, Gail exclaimed, the notion blossoming like the roses around them. A celebration for the seating area, and for every bud and blade we've nurtured here. It won't be this pretty for much longer. Fall is coming. Max's face lit up, his entrepreneurial mind already ticking over the potential benefits. Splendid idea. Our friends, family, even our guests, they should see what we've accomplished. We can have the restaurant make small appetizers to serve. In the ensuing days, invitations were penned with care and delivered with anticipation. Gail's practical nature shone through as she organized the logistics, while Max ensured that word of the event spread through their network of acquaintances. Gail looked around her on the day of the gathering, wanting everything to be just right. She had arranged tables adorned with crisp linen and vases of hand-picked flowers, each centerpiece a sample of the garden's splendor. As guests began to arrive, Max greeted them with the ease of a seasoned host, his warmth as genuine as the handshake he offered. Welcome to our little Eden, he said repeatedly, gesturing to the flourishing blooms that stood all around them. Did you really build all of this? An incredulous guest inquired, admiring the sturdy benches and vibrant flower beds. Every bit, Gail affirmed, her tone carrying the pride of someone who knew the value of hard work. When we first started, this was only a patch of dirt and untamed weeds. Laughter and conversation filled the air, mingling with the scent of blooming jasmine. Gail and Max moved through their guests, their tales of transformation eliciting nods of admiration and wide-eyed wonder. "Remember when that old sycamore threatened to topple over during the storm?" Max recounted, earning chuckles as he mimed holding up the tree with outstretched arms. "I wasn't sure we'd ever be able to make it beautiful again," Gail added, sharing a conspiratorial grin with Max as the guests marveled at the story. Expressions of gratitude flowed as freely as the lemonade from the pitchers. "This is a haven you both created," one customer remarked, a longtime patron of the restaurant. "Thank you," Max replied, his hand finding Gail's in a moment of shared acknowledgement. "It's been a difficult journey, but well worth the effort." When it was obvious their gathering was a huge success, Gail led Max down a cobblestone path, away from the gentle hubbub of the party. They found sanctuary beneath the canopy of a towering oak tree, its petals like whispers against the darkening sky. "Look at what we've accomplished," Gail breathed out, her eyes reflecting the myriad hues of twilight. Her hands clasped his own. Max's gaze lingered on her face, a canvas of contentment painted with strokes of fatigue. "From a patch of dirt to this," he said, gesturing at the blossoming oasis around them. "I never imagined." "Nor I," she interceded, her voice a melody of wonder. "And to think, our marriage began as a mere convenience." "A fortuitous arrangement indeed," Max chuckled, the sound rich with warmth. "For it brought me not only a partner in business, but a companion in life." "I never dreamed I'd love you as much as I do today," she said softly. He smiled, wrapping both arms around her and pulling her close. "I think I knew even then that you were meant to be my wife, my everything." After a long moment where they stood gazing into one another's eyes and forgetting the people around them, they rejoined the party, not wanting people to fault them. When they rejoined the crowd, Max poured them each a glass of lemonade and raised his glass in a toast. "To the gardens," Gail said, her voice steady as the land that bore their dreams. "And to us," Max added, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that surprised her. "May we continue to defy the odds," she continued, the corners of her mouth curling upwards. "May our love bloom ever brighter, against all expectations." His words were a soft vow, echoed by the clinking of glass against glass. There was laughter all around them as they were joined in the toast. They had built their dream, and it was perfect. "May I have this dance?" Max asked, as if he were asking for a great favor. "Only if you can keep up," Gail teased, her eyes twinkling with humor as she accepted his invitation. With laughter soft upon their lips, they began to dance right there in the middle of their party. As they moved, Gail's athletic grace was evident in each step, her form a fluid complement to Max's sure-footed poise. The garden, once wild and untamed, now mirrored the harmony they found in each other's arms, a balance of strength and beauty. "Look how far we've come," Gail whispered, her head resting against Max's shoulder as they swayed to the rhythm of the music. "We have," he murmured into her sun-kissed hair. "From a mere arrangement to something quite extraordinary." "Something like magic," she agreed, lifting her gaze to meet his. The warmth of Max's eyes reflected the starlight, their depths promising more than just the success of their partnership. Who would have dared to predict this? Max mused, spinning Gail gently under the vast expanse of sky. "Predictability is overrated," Gail countered with a grin. "Agreed. Let us be the couple that dances to the tune of our own making, rather than the one society orchestrates." "Defiant till the end," she said, a playful lilt to her words. "Especially till the end," he replied, sealing their pact with a swift kiss. Other couples began to join them in their dance, and it seemed to Gail that she was in the place she most loved in this world. Epilogue. Gail hoisted the wicker picnic basket, its contents clinking softly with each step she took down the winding path. The sun hung high in a cloudless sky above, drizzling warmth upon her shoulders as she navigated toward the alcove nestled amidst the burgeoning greenery of their garden. Her strides were swift, purposeful, the hem of her skirt brushing against the tops of her well-worn boots. Anna, Barney, and little Charles walked behind her, their laughter mingling with the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. "Careful now," Gail called over her shoulder, her eyes catching a glimpse of Charles teetering precariously on the uneven ground. "Don't go tripping over your own feet." As they reached the alcove, Gail set the basket down with a satisfying thud against the weathered wood of the bench. She smoothed out her skirt and settled herself, the solid structure reminding her of the days spent laboring beside Max to create this very spot, a haven within their slice of Fort Worth's outskirts. Anna, ever the curious child, hopped onto the bench opposite her mother. Her bright eyes sparkled with unspoken questions as she peered up at Gail. "Mama, can you tell us how you and Papa built the garden?" she asked, her voice ripe with the innocence of youth. Gail chuckled softly, leaning back against the bench. The story was one she cherished, a tale of sweat and soil that had blossomed into something far greater than she could have imagined. "Well, it was one of the hottest days I'd ever felt in my life when I stepped into the little church where a matchmaking dance was held," Gail began, a wistful smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Anna leaned forward, her hands propping up her chin with eager anticipation. Barney sat cross-legged on the ground, his young brow furrowed as he tried to picture the scene his mother painted with her words. Charles, though the youngest, nodded along as if he understood the weight of the memory. "I was only there for a few minutes when the matchmaker introduced me to the man who would change my life forever. His name was Max." "Max is our papa," Charles called out. Gail smiled softly. "Not then, he wasn't. Now, where was I?" She continued the story, thinking as she did of all she and Max had been through together. She'd happily do it all again if she could. Because she knew it would lead here. To this day. With these 3 beautiful children, and so much love in her heart for Max that she wasn't sure it could grow, but it would be more the following day, and the next after that.